The text arrived at exactly 7:18 p.m. Three simple words glowed against the dark screen of Jasmine Carter's phone. I love you. For a few beautiful seconds, those words felt warm, familiar, safe. She smiled without thinking, gently tracing her thumb across the message as if she could somehow feel the man behind it. It wasn't the first time Adrian Caldwell had sent those words, but tonight they seemed to carry a quiet promise. Below them was another message. Running 10 minutes late. Don't order without me. Jasmine slipped her phone into her purse and glanced toward the entrance of the elegant Chicago restaurant, expecting to see the city's most admired billionaire rushing through the doors with that apologetic smile she knew so well. Instead, her eyes drifted across the dining room, and time stopped. There was Adrian, already inside, not rushing, not looking for her, not running late. He was seated only a few tables away, laughing softly across a candlelit table with another woman. He had sent, I love you, while looking someone else in the eyes. Jasmine didn't gasp. She didn't storm across the room. She didn't throw a drink, make a scene, or demand an explanation. She simply looked at the phone one last time, then looked back at the man she thought she knew. In that unbearable silence, she realized something most people never understand until it's too late. Sometimes, the deepest betrayal doesn't begin with another kiss. It begins with a single lie that hides inside beautiful words. She quietly asked the waiter for the bill, even though her meal had never arrived. She left cash beneath the untouched glass of wine. She stood, adjusted her coat, and walked toward the exit, without Adrian ever realizing she had been there. Behind her, the restaurant buzzed with laughter, clinking glasses, and conversations that would be forgotten before morning. But the silence Jasmine carried out those doors would echo for the next year of both their lives. Because this isn't simply a story about catching a billionaire in a lie. It's a story about two people who spent their entire lives believing silence could protect them, until silence became the very thing that almost destroyed the love they never truly learned how to speak. Before we begin, welcome to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. If you enjoy heartfelt stories filled with real emotions, meaningful life lessons, and unforgettable characters, take a moment to subscribe, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments. As you listen, ask yourself one question. If you received a message saying, I love you, and discovered it was sent during a lie, would you walk away in silence, or would you demand the truth? Stay with us until the very end, because what Jasmine discovers that night isn't the whole story, and the truth waiting behind that lie will challenge everything you believe about love, trust, forgiveness, and the courage it takes to finally speak the words we've spent years keeping inside. Silence had always arrived before the pain. Long before Jasmine Carter ever stepped inside expensive restaurants or designed luxury buildings that reshaped Chicago's skyline, she learned that silence could keep a family from falling apart, at least for one more night. She was only 9 years old, the first time she understood that words could become weapons. It was a rainy Thursday evening in Milwaukee. Outside, water streamed down the living room windows in silver ribbons. Inside, her parents were arguing again. Their voices traveled through the small apartment walls as if they were competing with the thunder outside. You never listen, her mother shouted. I work 12 hours a day for this family. Her father fired back. Young Jasmine sat on the floor of her bedroom, with a box of colored pencils spread around her. She had been drawing a bridge for school, carefully shading every line, but every raised voice made her hands shake. She didn't cry anymore. She had learned that crying only made her younger brother cry too. Instead, she quietly walked into his room. Marcus was only 5. He looked up from his toy train with frightened eyes. Are they fighting again? He whispered. Jasmine forced a smile. They're just talking loudly. He knew she was lying. She knew he knew. But sometimes, a gentle lie felt kinder than a painful truth. She sat beside him on the floor, and began pushing the little train around its plastic tracks, until the shouting faded into the background. It became their routine. Whenever their parents argued, Jasmine distracted Marcus. Whenever dishes slammed or doors slammed harder, she invented games. Whenever tears filled the apartment, she filled the silence. No one asked how she felt. No one noticed she had quietly become the emotional adult in the room. Years later, a counselor would explain something Jasmine had never heard before. Children who grow up around constant conflict often become peacekeepers, the counselor had said. They mistake silence for safety. At the time, Jasmine simply nodded. She didn't know how deeply those words would shape the rest of her life. By the time she graduated from college, with honors in architecture, Jasmine had perfected the art of appearing calm. Professors admired her composure. Clients praised her professionalism. Friends described her as graceful under pressure. What they didn't know was that Jasmine wasn't naturally calm. She was simply afraid of conflict. She believed disagreements damaged relationships. She believed asking difficult questions pushed people away. Most importantly, She believed love meant keeping the peace, even when it cost her own voice. That belief followed her into adulthood like a shadow. At 34, Jasmine had become one of Chicago's most respected restoration architects. Unlike designers obsessed with building new skyscrapers, Jasmine loved preserving old buildings. She believed every cracked brick, weathered staircase, and faded doorway carried someone's story. Old buildings deserve second chances, she often told her team. One of her younger co-workers laughed one afternoon. You always say that. Because it's true. What about people? Jasmine paused longer than expected. I think people deserve second chances too. But only if they admit what needs repairing. The answer surprised even her. Perhaps because she wasn't talking about buildings anymore. Her office overlooked the Chicago River. Every morning, she arrived before sunrise carrying the same leather portfolio and a cup of black coffee from the cafe downstairs. She greeted the security guard by name. She watered the small peace lily sitting near her window. She reviewed construction drawings before anyone else arrived. Routine made her feel safe. Predictability quieted the noise she'd carried since childhood. Her assistant, Elena, often joked that Jasmine's calendar could probably predict the weather. You know, Elena said one Monday morning, one spontaneous decision won't ruin your life. Jasmine smiled. Maybe. You've been saying maybe for 3 years. I like having a plan. You like controlling surprises. Jasmine laughed softly. That's probably more accurate. Elena leaned against the doorway. You know what I think? What? I think you're happiest when life stays quiet. Jasmine looked back at the blueprints on her desk. Maybe she was. Or maybe she simply didn't know another way to live. There was only one person who regularly interrupted her carefully ordered world, Adrian Caldwell. His messages rarely arrived at expected times. Sometimes he texted before dawn. Sometimes close to midnight. Sometimes he called just to ask whether she'd eaten lunch. Other times, they could go an entire day speaking only once. Oddly enough, that rhythm suited Jasmine. Neither of them demanded constant attention. Neither believed every silence required explanation. Looking back later, she would wonder if that had been the first warning sign. Not that they were quiet, but that neither of them ever asked what those quiet moments truly meant. On Wednesday afternoons, Jasmine volunteered at a community design program for high school students interested in architecture. Most came from neighborhoods where opportunities were limited. She saw pieces of herself in many of them. One afternoon, a teenage girl named Ava stared at a rough sketch she'd drawn of a neighborhood library. It isn't good enough, Ava muttered, reaching for the trash can. Jasmine gently stopped her. Can I tell you something? Ava nodded. Every beautiful building starts as an imperfect sketch. The girl looked unconvinced. What if I mess everything up? Jasmine smiled warmly. Then you learn why it didn't work, and draw again. Ava folded the paper instead of throwing it away. As the students packed up for the evening, one young man lingered behind. Miss Carter? Yes? Can I ask you something? Of course. My parents fight all the time. Jasmine felt her chest tighten. I never know what to say. She was quiet for several seconds. Then she answered honestly. You don't always have to fix other people's arguments. He frowned. But if I don't? You are allowed to protect your own peace too. The words left her mouth before she realized she needed to hear them herself. Sometimes the advice we give others reveals the healing we still owe ourselves. That evening, Jasmine drove home through the glowing streets of Chicago thinking about the conversation. She had spent most of her life believing her job was to prevent conflict. Maybe that had never been her responsibility. Maybe peace built on silence wasn't peace at all. She didn't know it yet, but before the week was over, one unanswered question, one unopened conversation, and one text message containing 3 simple words would force her to confront every lesson she'd spent a lifetime avoiding. And the silence she had trusted for 25 years would finally demand its price. If Jasmine Carter learned that silence could keep a family together, Adrian Caldwell learned that silence was the price of belonging. Growing up in Chicago's Gold Coast, Adrian lived in a mansion so large that visitors often mistook it for a boutique hotel. It had 12 bedrooms, a private library, an indoor pool, and enough staff to ensure that every need was met before anyone asked. Yet despite its grandeur, the house rarely felt like a home. Every morning at precisely 7 o'clock, breakfast was served in the formal dining room. His father sat at the head of the long mahogany table reading financial newspapers. His mother reviewed charity schedules and gala invitations. Conversations, when they happened, revolved around business deals, investment strategies, or public appearances. No one asked questions like, "How are you feeling?" No one said, "I'm proud of you." Love wasn't expressed through words. It was measured by expectations, At 10 years old, Adrian came home carrying a blue ribbon from a citywide science competition. He had spent months building a solar-powered model car, staying up late after homework to perfect every detail. He placed the ribbon carefully on the dining table. His father glanced at it for barely 2 seconds. "First place?" Adrian nodded excitedly. "Good." That was all. No smile, no hug, no celebration. Just one word before his father returned to reading stock reports. His mother looked up briefly. "You represented the family well." Then she resumed writing thank you notes for a fundraising banquet. That evening, Adrian carried the ribbon back to his bedroom. He placed it inside a drawer instead of hanging it on the wall. Not because he wasn't proud of it. Because he'd learned that achievements were expected, not celebrated. The next morning, he stopped hoping for praise. Over time, he stopped expecting emotional conversations altogether. By high school, Adrian had become remarkably composed. Teachers admired his discipline. Classmates respected his confidence. What no one recognized was that confidence and emotional distance often look the same from the outside. Whenever something hurt him, he buried it beneath another goal. Whenever he felt disappointed, he worked harder. Whenever he wanted comfort, he reminded himself that successful men didn't need comforting. It was a lesson he never questioned, until years later. At 29, Adrian founded a financial technology company with 2 college friends. The first year was brutal. They worked from a cramped office above an old print shop. The roof leaked whenever it rained. They took turns sleeping on worn-out couches because they couldn't afford nearby apartments. Many investors rejected them. Some laughed openly during presentations. "You've got ambition," one executive told Adrian, "but ambition doesn't guarantee profit." Adrian thanked him politely, then walked outside without showing how deeply those words stung. His business partner, Owen, caught up with him on the sidewalk. "You okay?" Adrian adjusted his tie. "I'm fine." "You don't look fine." "I said, I'm fine." Owen studied him for a moment before sighing. "You know, one day you're going to realize that pretending nothing bothers you doesn't make you stronger." Adrian gave a faint smile. "Maybe." It was the only answer he ever offered when conversations became too personal. 3 years later, the company revolutionized digital payment security. Investors who once dismissed them competed to buy shares. Within 5 years, Adrian became one of the youngest self-made billionaires in Illinois. Magazine covers called him visionary. Television hosts praised his discipline. Business journals admired his calm leadership during economic uncertainty. Employees often described him as impossible to read. They meant it as a compliment. Adrian accepted it that way. Inside, however, he had become someone who solved every problem except the ones inside his own heart. The first time Adrian met Jasmine Carter, he wasn't looking for love. He wasn't looking for anything except a restored warehouse. One of his companies had purchased a century-old brick building overlooking the Chicago River. Most investors wanted to demolish it. Adrian disagreed. "There are enough glass towers in this city," he told his executive team. "Some history deserves to stay standing." One architect's proposal stood out among dozens of submissions. It wasn't the flashiest design. It wasn't the most expensive. It simply understood the building. The presentation came from Jasmine Carter. During the planning meeting, Adrian noticed something unusual. While other architects spent most of their time discussing themselves, Jasmine spoke almost entirely about the building. She described its history, its craftsmanship, the families who once worked there. She talked about preserving stories rather than replacing them. When the meeting ended, Adrian caught up with her in the hallway. "You care about buildings the way some people care about family." Jasmine looked slightly embarrassed. "I guess I do." "Why?" She smiled thoughtfully. "Because if we're always chasing what's new, we forget what made us." That answer stayed with him long after she walked away. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rehearsed. It was simply honest, a quality he rarely encountered. Over the following months, project meetings became lunches. Lunches became evening walks along the Riverwalk. Eventually, without either of them formally defining it, friendship became something deeper. Neither rushed the relationship. Neither believed in grand romantic gestures. Instead, love revealed itself through ordinary moments. Adrian remembered how Jasmine always ordered hot tea after dinner, instead of dessert. Jasmine noticed he removed his watch whenever he wanted to think carefully. He learned she collected antique postcards from cities she'd visited. She learned he secretly enjoyed visiting bookstores even though business magazines constantly featured him as a relentless executive. On rainy Saturdays, they wandered through museums. On quiet Sunday mornings, they visited neighborhood cafes before the crowds arrived. Sometimes they spent an hour together saying almost nothing. Neither found the silence uncomfortable. In fact, they considered it proof of how well they understood each other. Friends often commented on it. "I've never seen two people so comfortable without talking," one friend remarked during a dinner party. Jasmine smiled. It feels peaceful. Adrian nodded. We don't have to fill every moment. Everyone admired that answer. No one questioned it. Not even them. One autumn evening, they sat on a park bench overlooking Lake Michigan. The wind carried the scent of fallen leaves across the water. Jasmine rested her head lightly against Adrian's shoulder. Can I ask you something? Anything. What were you like as a kid? Adrian watched the waves instead of answering immediately. I was busy. She laughed softly. Busy isn't a personality. It was mine. You don't talk much about your childhood. There isn't much to tell. Jasmine sensed there was far more he wasn't saying, but instead of asking another question, she simply nodded. The conversation drifted to other topics. Neither realized they had just missed an opportunity to know each other more deeply. Silence had protected them once again. But protection and connection are not the same thing. Several weeks later, Jasmine invited Adrian to speak to her architecture students about leadership. The teenagers expected a polished billionaire delivering motivational cliches. Instead, Adrian surprised them. One student raised his hand. Mr. Caldwell, what's the most important thing you've learned about success? The room grew quiet. Adrian thought for a moment. Success means very little if you don't know who you're becoming while you're chasing it. The students scribbled notes. Another asked, do you ever fail? He smiled faintly. More often than magazines would like you to believe. The room laughed. Jasmine watched him from the back. She admired this version of Adrian. Patient, thoughtful, authentic. Later, as they walked toward the parking lot, she smiled. You were good with them. They asked honest questions. You like honesty? I do. She slipped her hand into his. So do I. Neither noticed the quiet irony of that conversation. Both claimed to value honesty. Yet both avoided the very conversations that required it most. That winter, Adrian invited Jasmine to a charity gala. The ballroom sparkled beneath crystal chandeliers. Photographers lined the entrance. Business leaders and celebrities filled the room. Jasmine had never enjoyed events like these, but Adrian's quiet confidence helped her relax. At one point during the evening, an elderly philanthropist approached them. He had been married for nearly 50 years. Looking at the couple, he smiled knowingly. Can I offer you both a little advice? Of course, Jasmine replied. The man lifted his glass. The happiest marriages aren't built on never arguing. He paused. They're built on never being afraid to tell each other the truth. Adrian smiled politely. So honesty matters more than harmony. The older man chuckled. Real honesty creates harmony. Fake harmony only delays heartbreak. The words lingered in Jasmine's mind long after the conversation ended. She looked at Adrian. He seemed thoughtful. Neither of them knew that before long, those very words would become the lesson they wished they had learned sooner. Because love isn't tested when everything is peaceful. It's tested when the truth becomes uncomfortable. And somewhere in the days ahead, one text message, one restaurant, and one quiet decision would force both of them to discover whether the silence they cherished was truly love. Or simply fear wearing the disguise of peace. Before we continue, take a moment to think about Jasmine and Adrian's story. Have you ever believed that staying quiet would protect someone you loved, only to realize later that silence created an even bigger distance? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think silence strengthens a relationship, or does honest communication always matter more? If this story is already touching your heart, please take a second to like this video, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, and share it with someone who believes that love is built on trust, honesty, and understanding. Stay with me, because in the next chapter, one ordinary dinner reservation, one unexpected text message, and one quiet glance across a crowded restaurant will change Jasmine and Adrian's lives forever. The reservation had been on Jasmine Carter's calendar for nearly 3 weeks. It wasn't an anniversary. It wasn't a birthday. There was no special occasion at all. That was precisely why she had been looking forward to it. Life with Adrian Caldwell rarely allowed uninterrupted evenings anymore. Between his board meetings, investor conferences, and charity commitments, and Jasmine's demanding restoration projects across Chicago, finding time to simply sit together without phones or schedules had become surprisingly difficult. So when Adrian suggested dinner at Le Marais, one of the city's most elegant French restaurants overlooking the river, Jasmine smiled the moment she saw the confirmation email. Sometimes, the simplest plans meant the most. Friday arrived with unusually warm weather for early October. The city glowed beneath a golden sunset as office workers spilled onto sidewalks, taxis filled the streets, and the Chicago River reflected streaks of orange and pink across its surface. Jasmine stood in front of her bedroom mirror, debating between 2 dresses. One was a sleek black dress she usually wore to formal galas. The other was a deep emerald green dress Adrian had once quietly complimented. "You look happiest in green," he'd told her months earlier. "Not because it was expensive, not because it was fashionable. It matches your eyes when you smile." She remembered those words now. Without hesitation, she chose the green dress. As she fastened a pair of pearl earrings her grandmother had left her years ago, she caught herself smiling. Not because she expected a grand romantic evening, because she missed him. That realization surprised her. You can love someone deeply and still miss them while they're part of your everyday life. Relationships don't drift apart overnight. Sometimes they simply become crowded by everything except each other. Before leaving her apartment, Jasmine watered the peace lily sitting near her kitchen window. It had been a gift from one of her architecture students after graduation. Attached to the pot was a handwritten note. "Thank you for teaching us that restoration is another form of hope." Every time she read those words, she felt grateful. Buildings weren't the only things capable of being restored. People were too. She locked her apartment, stepped into the elevator, and headed downtown. Traffic crawled through evening congestion. Instead of growing impatient, Jasmine turned off the radio and watched the city pass by. Children laughed outside a neighborhood ice cream shop. A street musician played a saxophone beneath the elevated train tracks. An elderly couple walked hand in hand, despite moving at half the speed of everyone around them. She wondered how many years they had spent learning each other. Love, she thought, probably looked quieter after decades together. Less about excitement, more about choosing each other every day. Le Marais occupied the first floor of a beautifully restored 19th century building. Ironically, Jasmine herself had consulted on parts of its preservation several years earlier. The original brick walls remained untouched. Vintage chandeliers cast warm light across polished wooden floors. Fresh flowers decorated every table. Soft piano music floated through the dining room without overpowering conversation. It was elegant without feeling intimidating. Exactly the sort of place Adrian preferred. The hostess greeted Jasmine with a warm smile. "Good evening, Miss Carter." "Good evening. Mr. Caldwell reserved your favorite table." Jasmine smiled. He remembered? Of course. The hostess led her toward a quiet corner overlooking the river. The table offered just enough privacy without feeling isolated. Adrian always requested it whenever they came. Small details mattered to him. Or at least, they always had. Jasmine checked the time. 7:12 p.m. She had arrived early. That wasn't unusual. She believed keeping people waiting suggested their time mattered less than yours. It was another lesson inherited from her mother. While waiting, she ordered sparkling water with lemon. The waiter handed her a menu. She barely glanced at it. She already knew what she'd order. Grilled salmon, roasted vegetables. And if Adrian convinced her, as he usually did, they'd share the restaurant's famous chocolate soufflé. He always claimed he wasn't hungry for dessert. He always stole half of hers. The predictability made her smile. Routine wasn't boring. It was comforting. A vibration interrupted her thoughts. Her phone lit up. Adrian. She opened the message immediately. "I love you." 3 words. Simple. Familiar. The kind that still warmed her heart after nearly 3 years together. Another message followed seconds later. "Running about 10 minutes late. Don't order without me." Jasmine laughed softly. She typed back. "Only because you're buying dessert." She hit send. No response. Probably driving, she assumed. She slipped the phone into her purse, then looked toward the restaurant entrance. No Adrian. She leaned back comfortably in her chair. 10 minutes wasn't a problem. She actually welcomed the chance to simply observe the room around her. Restaurants fascinated her. Not because of the food, because every table held a different story. Near the window, 2 elderly women laughed over coffee. Across the room, a young man nervously rehearsed something under his breath, while hiding a small velvet ring box beneath the table. Near the bar, a father patiently helped his little daughter color on a paper placemat while waiting for their meals. Everywhere she looked, people were sharing pieces of their lives, some beginning, some ending, most completely invisible to everyone else. She often wondered how many important moments happened in ordinary places without anyone realizing history was quietly being written. The pianist transitioned into a slower melody. Almost instinctively, Jasmine turned toward the center of the dining room. Her eyes wandered across polished wine glasses, past smiling waiters, beyond flickering candlelight, and then they stopped. Not because someone called her name, not because anything dramatic happened, simply because her mind recognized a familiar face before her heart could understand what she was seeing. Adrian. He was already inside, only 4 tables away. His back partially faced her. He wasn't looking toward the entrance. He wasn't checking his watch. He wasn't waiting for her. He was sitting comfortably across from a blonde woman dressed in a navy blazer. The 2 of them were deep in conversation. Adrian smiled, then laughed. Not the polite laugh he used during business meetings. A genuine one. The kind Jasmine hadn't heard in weeks. For one impossible second, her mind refused to accept what her eyes clearly saw. Maybe he'd arrived early and accidentally sat with someone he recognized. Maybe she misunderstood. Maybe. Her phone vibrated again. She looked down. Nothing from Adrian. Only a promotional email. When she looked back up, he gently lifted his water glass. The woman mirrored the gesture. They toasted. Jasmine's heartbeat slowed instead of speeding up. Oddly, she felt completely calm. Not because she wasn't hurt, because shock has a strange way of silencing emotion before it arrives. She didn't move, didn't wave, didn't call his name. Instead, she simply watched. And in that quiet moment, she realized something she would never forget. The most painful discoveries often happen without a single word being spoken. Jasmine didn't blink. She was afraid that if she did, the scene across the restaurant might disappear, and she'd convince herself she'd imagined it. But when she looked again, Adrian was still there, still smiling, still talking, still completely unaware that the woman waiting for him sat only a few tables away. The candlelight softened the lines of his face, the same face that had looked at her that morning before leaving for work, the same face that had kissed her forehead and whispered, "Have a good day," the same face that had texted, "I love you." Jasmine lowered her eyes to her phone. The message remained on the screen. 3 words. 3 beautiful words. And suddenly they felt heavier than they ever had before. Not because she no longer believed he had once meant them, but because, at this very moment, his words and his actions existed in 2 different places. That realization hurt more than anger ever could. She looked up once more. The woman across from Adrian appeared to be in her late 30s. Confident, elegant, professional. She wasn't dressed for a romantic evening. There were no lingering touches, no flirtatious smiles, no obvious signs of intimacy. Instead, there was something else. Comfort. The kind of comfort shared by people with history. People who already knew each other. The woman reached into her handbag and removed a thick envelope. She slid it across the table. Adrian accepted it. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he rested one hand on the envelope and nodded while she spoke. His expression changed. The laughter disappeared. He looked reflective, almost sad. Jasmine couldn't hear a single word. She didn't know what the envelope contained. She didn't know who the woman was. She didn't know why Adrian had chosen not to tell her he would be meeting someone before dinner. She only knew one undeniable fact. He had lied, not necessarily about love, but about where he was. And sometimes, one lie is enough to make every truth around it feel uncertain. The waiter approached her table with a warm smile. "Are you ready to order, Miss Carter?" Jasmine looked at the menu without actually seeing the words. "No." She managed a gentle smile. "I think I need just a little more time." "Of course." He walked away. Jasmine folded her hands together beneath the table. Her grandmother had once told her something she never forgot. When your emotions become loud, don't let your decisions become louder. At the time, Jasmine thought her grandmother was simply talking about arguments. Tonight, those words became an anchor. She could walk over. She could confront Adrian. She could demand an explanation in front of an entire restaurant. Many people would. Few would blame her. But another voice whispered inside her. "Not here. Not like this. Not before you know the whole story." Her heart wanted answers. Her dignity wanted patience. Across the room, Adrian leaned back in his chair. For a brief second, he glanced toward the entrance. Jasmine instinctively lowered her head. Not because she was hiding, because she wasn't ready to be seen. When she looked up again, he'd already turned back to the conversation. She studied him carefully. Something about his posture felt different. He wasn't relaxed. He wasn't celebrating. His shoulders carried tension. The woman spoke for several minutes, while Adrian listened without interrupting. Then she reached across the table, not to hold his hand, only to briefly touch his wrist, a gesture of reassurance. It lasted less than 2 seconds, yet, to Jasmine, it felt much longer. Not because it proved romance, because it proved familiarity. There was history between them. History Adrian had never mentioned. Questions flooded her mind. Who is she? Why didn't he tell me? How long has he known her? Why pretend to be late when you're already here? None of those questions had answers, not yet. And Jasmine refused to invent answers simply because she lacked information. She had spent too many years watching people destroy relationships by assuming, instead of asking. Still, one question refused to leave her. If there was nothing wrong with this meeting, why hide it? The pianist finished another song. Soft applause drifted through the room. Life continued, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. A young couple celebrated an engagement. Business executives discussed quarterly reports. A family laughed over birthday cake. No one noticed the woman quietly watching her relationship change without a single raised voice. Sometimes heartbreak doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it simply sits beside you while the rest of the world keeps smiling. Jasmine reached into her purse and removed her wallet. The waiter returned almost immediately. "Have you decided?" She looked up kindly. "Actually, I'll just pay for the water." He seemed surprised. "Will Mr. Caldwell still be joining you?" The question lingered between them. Jasmine glanced once more toward Adrian. He still hadn't looked in her direction. She smiled politely. "I don't think so." The waiter hesitated. "I'm sorry to hear that." "So am I." It wasn't bitterness. It was honesty. He brought the bill. Jasmine placed several bills inside the leather folder, adding a generous tip. The waiter thanked her warmly. She stood slowly, smoothing the front of her emerald green dress. For one final moment, she looked across the restaurant. Adrian smiled faintly at something the woman had just said. Jasmine noticed details she knew she would remember forever. The untouched bread basket on their table, the half-empty glass of sparkling water, the envelope still resting beside Adrian's hand, the gold watch she'd given him on his 40th birthday, the way he absent-mindedly tapped his fingers whenever he was thinking. Tiny details, ordinary details, the kinds of memories people don't realize they're collecting until they're standing at the end of something. Without making a sound, Jasmine turned toward the exit. Each step felt strangely steady, not because she wasn't hurting, because pain hadn't fully reached her yet. Shock often arrives first. Grief follows later. The hostess smiled as Jasmine passed. "Leaving already?" Jasmine returned the smile. Something came up. Technically, that wasn't a lie. Outside, cool evening air greeted her. The sounds of Chicago surrounded her. Car horns, distant sirens, laughter from people walking along the river. The city continued exactly as it had before she entered the restaurant. But Jasmine felt different. She walked several blocks without any destination. Eventually, she reached the Riverwalk. She leaned against the railing, watching reflections shimmer across the dark water. Her phone buzzed again. "Adrian." She stared at his name. The message read, "Parking was worse than I expected. I'll be there in about 5 minutes." Jasmine closed her eyes. He didn't know she had already seen him. He didn't know she had watched him laugh. He didn't know she had quietly walked away. Most importantly, he didn't know that his second lie hurt even more than the first. For several seconds, her thumb hovered above the keyboard. She could expose everything with one sentence. "I'm already here. I saw you. Who is she?" Instead, she locked her phone, slipped it back into her purse, and kept walking. Not because she was weak, not because she was avoiding the truth, because she wanted whatever happened next to begin with honesty, not anger. As she disappeared into the Chicago night, Jasmine made one silent promise to herself. She would never accuse someone based on assumptions, but she would also never ignore what she had clearly seen. Sometimes wisdom means refusing to jump to conclusions, and sometimes self-respect means refusing to ignore your own eyes. She didn't know which lesson would matter more, but before this story was over, she would learn that silence can protect your dignity for a moment. Yet, if it lasts too long, it can also separate two hearts that still love each other. The question was no longer whether Adrian had lied. The question was why, and that answer would change everything. Jasmine didn't answer Adrian's message that night. She didn't block his number. She didn't delete their photos. She didn't post cryptic quotes on social media or call her friends to tell them what had happened. Instead, she went home. She changed out of her emerald green dress, carefully hung it back in the closet, washed the light makeup from her face, and made herself a cup of chamomile tea she never drank. The mug sat untouched on the kitchen counter until it grew cold. She spent most of the night sitting beside the window, watching the lights of Chicago flicker across the skyline. Every few minutes, her phone lit up. "Adrian, I'm here. Where are you?" 5 minutes later. "Did something happen?" Another 10 minutes. "Jasmine, I'm worried." Then, "Please, call me." She read every message. She answered none of them. Not because she wanted to punish him, because she didn't yet know what to say. There are moments in life when speaking too soon can do just as much damage as remaining silent forever. Jasmine understood that. She also understood something else. The next conversation they had would change their relationship forever. She wanted to make sure it happened when she could listen as carefully as she spoke. She barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the same image. Adrian laughing, the candlelight, the envelope, the text message that still echoed in her mind. "I love you." Those words had become strangely confusing. Was he lying about loving her, or only lying about where he was? There was an important difference. Unfortunately, pain rarely waits for clarification before making itself comfortable. The following morning, Jasmine arrived at her office nearly an hour earlier than usual. Chicago's streets were still quiet. The elevators hadn't begun their usual rush. The office lights remained dim, except for the glow coming from her desk lamp. She welcomed the silence. Work had always been the one place where problems made sense. Buildings cracked for understandable reasons. Old foundations weakened over time. Water damage left visible evidence. Every problem had a cause. Every cause had a solution. Human hearts were nothing like buildings. Some of the deepest fractures remained invisible until everything collapsed. Her assistant, Elena, arrived shortly after 8. The moment she saw Jasmine, she paused. "You look tired." "I didn't sleep much." "Everything okay?" Jasmine smiled politely. "I've just had a lot on my mind." Elena studied her for a second. In the 3 years they'd worked together, she'd learned something about Jasmine. Whenever Jasmine said she was fine, it usually meant she wanted privacy, not advice. So Elena nodded. "If you need anything." "I know." "And coffee?" Jasmine laughed softly. "Definitely coffee." As Elena disappeared toward the break room, Jasmine felt grateful. Real friendship didn't always demand explanations. Sometimes it simply made room for them when you were ready. Around 10 o'clock, Jasmine's phone buzzed again. Adrian. She stared at his name for nearly 30 seconds before letting the call go to voicemail. A few moments later, another message arrived. "Can we please talk?" She placed the phone face down. Not out of anger, out of necessity. She wasn't ready. There is a difference between avoiding a conversation and preparing for one. Many people confuse the two. One delays healing, the other protects it. Jasmine hoped she was doing the second. Across the city, Adrian Caldwell hadn't slept either. His apartment overlooked Lake Michigan, but that morning he barely noticed the sunrise spreading across the water. He stood in his kitchen staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. He replayed the previous evening again and again. He'd arrived at Le Marais much earlier than planned. Claire had insisted she could only meet before catching an evening flight. She'd promised it would take 15 minutes. It had taken almost 40. By the time Adrian checked his watch, panic washed over him. He texted Jasmine immediately, running about 10 minutes late. Then another unexpected conversation delayed him further. After Claire finally left, Adrian walked to the table Jasmine had reserved. She wasn't there. At first, he assumed she'd been delayed too. 10 minutes became 20. 20 became 30. Eventually, the hostess approached. "I'm sorry, Mr. Caldwell. Has Miss Carter called?" "No." He frowned. "Did she arrive earlier?" The hostess hesitated. "I don't think I should discuss another guest's visit." Another guest's visit. The words barely registered at the time. Only later, after replaying the evening countless times, did they begin to haunt him. Had Jasmine been there? Had she seen something? The thought settled heavily in his chest. His longtime assistant, Daniel, entered the office, carrying the day's schedule. "You have the board meeting at 9, the investor presentation at 11, and I'm cancelling everything." Daniel looked stunned. "You've never cancelled a board meeting." "I am today." "Is everything all right?" Adrian rubbed his forehead. "I honestly don't know." Daniel had worked beside Adrian for almost 8 years. He'd seen billion-dollar negotiations, corporate crises, media scandals. He had never seen Adrian look this unsettled. "If there's anything I can do." "There is." Daniel waited. "Tell everyone I need one day." Done. No questions, no arguments, just trust. Adrian appreciated that more than he said. He drove to Jasmine's apartment. Her car was gone. He waited nearly an hour anyway. Nothing. Then he drove to her office building. He never went inside. He simply sat across the street, wondering whether she was looking out one of the windows. Wondering if she hated him. Wondering if she even wanted to see him. For the first time in years, Adrian realized that money could solve almost every problem, except the one that mattered most. No amount of wealth could buy another person's willingness to have a difficult conversation. Trust had to be given freely. And once damaged, it couldn't be purchased back. Meanwhile, Jasmine buried herself in blueprints. She measured historical columns, reviewed restoration budgets, approved engineering revisions. On paper, she looked productive. In reality, she hadn't read the same page 3 times because her thoughts kept drifting elsewhere. Around lunchtime, one of her younger architects knocked on her office door. "Do you have a minute?" "Of course." The young man entered carrying renovation sketches. "I'm stuck." She studied the drawings carefully. "What seems to be the problem?" "The client wants us to cover the original brick walls." "Why?" "They think newer always looks better." Jasmine smiled faintly. "What do you think?" "I think we'd erase the building's history." She nodded. Exactly. He frowned. But convincing people is hard. Jasmine looked down at the old brick illustrated on the plans, then quietly said something that surprised even herself. The truth is sometimes uncomfortable. He waited. But hiding it never makes it disappear. The young architect smiled. I'll remember that. After he left, Jasmine sat motionless. Her own words echoed inside the office. The truth is sometimes uncomfortable, but hiding it never makes it disappear. She wondered if life had just handed her the advice she needed most, because somewhere across Chicago, a man she still loved was hiding a truth. And somewhere inside herself, she was hiding the fact that she'd already seen enough to know something had changed forever. Neither of them had spoken. Yet, with every passing hour, the silence between them grew louder. By Wednesday morning, 5 days had passed since the dinner that never happened. 5 days. To most people, it wasn't a long time. To Jasmine, it felt like living inside a conversation that had started but never reached its first sentence. Adrian had called 18 times. He'd sent 11 text messages, 3 voicemails, and 1 handwritten note delivered by courier. She hadn't answered any of them, not because she wanted him to suffer, because she still wasn't certain what she believed. There is a dangerous space between facts and assumptions. Many relationships are destroyed inside that space. Jasmine refused to fill it with guesses. She wanted the truth, but she also knew the truth couldn't be forced. It had to be offered. That afternoon, she left work earlier than usual to visit the person who had always helped her untangle complicated thoughts. Her grandmother. Margaret Carter lived in a quiet neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. Her small brick house looked almost exactly the same as it had 20 years earlier. White rocking chairs sat on the front porch. Rose bushes lined the walkway. Wind chimes sang softly whenever the breeze passed through the maple tree in the yard. Walking onto that porch always made Jasmine feel like she could finally breathe. Margaret opened the door before Jasmine even knocked. I had a feeling you'd come today. Jasmine smiled weakly. How do you always know? Because your eyes get quieter before your feet find my porch. Jasmine laughed for the first time in days. Her grandmother hugged her tightly. No questions. No pressure, just warmth. Sometimes, love doesn't begin with advice. Sometimes it begins with making someone feel safe enough to tell the truth. They sat at the kitchen table drinking sweet tea. The same kitchen where Jasmine had baked cookies as a little girl. The same kitchen where she'd hidden after her parents divorced. The same kitchen where she'd celebrated college acceptance, career promotions and birthdays. Some places become emotional anchors. This was one of them. Margaret watched her granddaughter stir the ice in her glass without taking a sip. You've been quiet. Jasmine smiled faintly. You've always said that silence means something. It usually does. Another minute passed. Finally, Jasmine spoke. If someone you loved lied to you. Margaret didn't interrupt. But you didn't know why. Still no interruption. Would you leave? Margaret folded her hands together. That depends. On what? Whether they lied to protect themselves. She paused. Or to protect someone else. Jasmine looked confused. Isn't a lie still a lie? It is. Then why does the reason matter? Her grandmother smiled gently. Because understanding isn't the same thing as excusing. Those words settled into the room like sunlight through the curtains. Understanding isn't the same as excusing. Many people confuse forgiveness with pretending nothing happened. Margaret never had. What happened? She asked softly. Jasmine took a long breath. Then she told her everything. The reservation, the text, the restaurant, the woman, the envelope, the second lie. She described every detail exactly as she'd seen it. When she finished, Margaret remained silent for nearly a minute. Not because she didn't know what to say, because she respected difficult moments enough not to rush them. Finally, she asked one question. Did you see him betray your love? Jasmine waited. Or did you see him hide the truth? The question caught her completely off guard. You don't know yet. No. You know he lied. Yes. But you don't know why. Jasmine slowly nodded. Margaret reached across the table and gently covered Jasmine's hand with her own. Sweetheart. Don't let pain finish writing a story before truth gets the chance. Jasmine looked down at her tea. How many people, she wondered, had ended relationships because they assumed they already knew every chapter. Across town, Adrian sat alone inside his office. For the 5th straight day, the large conference room outside buzzed with meetings. Executives hurried between departments. Phones rang constantly, yet Adrian barely noticed. His attention remained fixed on a small framed photograph sitting beside his computer. It had been taken nearly a year earlier. Jasmine stood beside him wearing jeans and a baseball cap, laughing after accidentally dropping ice cream on his expensive shoes. Neither of them looked polished. Neither posed for the camera. It was one of his favorite photographs, because it captured something money could never buy. Peace. Daniel knocked lightly before entering. You have a visitor. I'm not seeing anyone. I figured. Daniel hesitated. But I think you'll want to. Who is it? Owen. Adrian sighed. His former business partner walked in carrying 2 paper coffee cups. I brought your favorite. I'm not really. I know. Owen handed him the coffee anyway before sitting across the desk. You look terrible. Thanks. I mean it as a compliment. Adrian laughed, despite himself. I've had better weeks. I noticed. Owen leaned forward. Want to tell me what happened? Adrian rarely spoke about his personal life. This time, he did. He explained meeting Claire, her request for closure, the envelope containing old letters and photographs from years earlier, the delayed dinner, Jasmine disappearing, every unanswered message. When he finished, Owen didn't respond immediately. Instead, he asked a question Adrian hadn't expected. Why didn't you tell Jasmine before the meeting? Adrian looked away. I thought she'd misunderstand. So, Owen folded his arms. You chose a lie that guaranteed she'd misunderstand. Silence filled the office, because there was no argument against the truth. Adrian rubbed his forehead. I wasn't trying to hurt her. I believe that. Then why does it feel like I destroyed everything? Owen looked directly at his oldest friend. Because intention doesn't erase impact. Those 4 words landed harder than any business failure Adrian had ever experienced. Intention doesn't erase impact. How many times had he judged employees by results rather than intentions? Yet, when it came to his own life, he'd expected different rules. That evening, Adrian finally opened the envelope Claire had given him. Inside were photographs from their engagement years earlier, old letters, a wedding invitation they'd never used, and one handwritten note. It read, Thank you for giving me the courage to leave a relationship we both knew wasn't right. I finally found peace, and I hope you do too. You deserve someone you can tell everything to. Don't waste that gift the way we did. Adrian read the final sentence 3 times. You deserve someone you can tell everything to. Ironically, the very meeting meant to close one chapter had exposed the biggest weakness in his current relationship. Not because he'd met Claire, because he hadn't trusted Jasmine enough to tell her he would. Meanwhile, Jasmine returned home from her grandmother's house, feeling lighter. Not happier, just clearer. She finally understood something important. She didn't need to decide that night whether Adrian deserved forgiveness. She first needed to decide whether he deserved the opportunity to explain. Those were 2 completely different decisions. Education often begins the moment we realize life isn't divided into simple categories of right and wrong. Sometimes wisdom lives in the space between judgment and understanding. Jasmine stood by her apartment window, watching city lights shimmer against the evening sky. Her phone rested on the coffee table. Quiet, still, waiting. She walked toward it, picked it up, scrolled through Adrian's messages. Then, for the first time in 5 days, she typed, not an accusation, not forgiveness, just one sentence. We need to talk. Not tonight, soon. She stared at the screen, read the words twice, then pressed send. Less than 30 seconds later, 3 dots appeared. Adrian was typing. Jasmine didn't open the reply, not yet, because for the first time since that night at the restaurant, the silence between them had finally begun to move. Not toward blame, but toward the possibility of truth. And sometimes, one honest conversation begins with only 4 simple words. We need to talk. Jasmine didn't read Adrian's reply until the following morning. She wasn't trying to play games. She wasn't trying to make him anxious. She simply wanted to prove something to herself. For the first time in years, she wasn't going to let urgency make her decisions. When she finally unlocked her phone over breakfast, Adrian's message was waiting exactly where she'd left it. Thank you for giving me the chance to explain. I'll meet you whenever and wherever you feel comfortable. I'll answer every question honestly, no excuses. She read it twice. Then she placed the phone beside her coffee mug and stared out the kitchen window. It wasn't a perfect message, but it was different. For the first time since she'd known him, Adrian hadn't tried to solve the problem. He hadn't defended himself. He hadn't insisted she'd misunderstood. He had simply agreed to tell the truth. It was a small step. Sometimes the smallest steps are the hardest ones to take. Instead of replying immediately, Jasmine left for work. The October air carried the crisp scent of changing seasons. Leaves drifted across the sidewalks as commuters hurried through downtown Chicago with coffee cups in one hand and briefcases in the other. The city looked exactly the same. But Jasmine noticed something different. She wasn't replaying the restaurant in her mind every 5 minutes anymore. Her thoughts had shifted. She no longer wondered only about what Adrian had done. She wondered why neither of them had built a relationship where difficult conversations felt safe. That question unsettled her, because it meant responsibility might not belong entirely to one person. Trust can be broken by one person's lie. But emotional distance is often built one quiet moment at a time. At the office, Elena walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I brought the stronger roast today." Jasmine smiled. "You know me too well. I know your face." "What does that mean?" "It means you don't wear stress very well." Jasmine laughed softly. "I thought I was hiding it." "You've never been good at hiding it from people who actually know you." She handed Jasmine the coffee before sitting across from her desk. "You don't have to tell me what's going on." "I appreciate that. But—" Elena smiled knowingly. "I'm going to remind you of something anyway." Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "What?" "You spend your career restoring buildings that other people have given up on." "I do, but you never restore them by pretending the cracks don't exist." Jasmine looked down at the blueprint spread across her desk. "No. You inspect every damaged beam." "Yes. You ask difficult questions." "I have to. And then you decide whether the foundation is still strong enough to save." The office fell quiet. Elena stood. "I don't know what's happening in your personal life." She picked up her empty coffee cup. "But I know this." She smiled warmly. "Whatever you decide, make sure it's based on truth, not fear." After Elena left, Jasmine remained motionless. She glanced at the century-old theater blueprint lying before her. Large sections had suffered water damage. The restoration would take months, maybe longer. Yet no engineer had suggested covering the damage with fresh paint. Everyone understood that hidden problems only became bigger problems. Why, then, were relationships any different? Across the city, Adrian stood in front of a room filled with executives. A quarterly strategy meeting. Normally, he commanded every discussion with calm confidence. Today, he lost his train of thought halfway through a presentation. One executive cleared his throat. "Mr. Caldwell?" Adrian blinked. "I'm sorry." He closed the presentation on the screen. "I think we're finished for today." The executives exchanged confused glances. One board member spoke carefully. "Are you sure? We still have 2 agenda items." "They can wait." As everyone filed out, Owen remained behind. "You cancelled another meeting." "I know. You've never done that before." Adrian loosened his tie. "I've spent years believing business came first." "And now?" He looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Chicago. "Now I'm wondering what success is worth, if the person I wanted to share it with no longer trusts me." Owen nodded slowly. "That's a painful question." "It is. But maybe it's the first honest one I've asked myself in a long time." That afternoon, Adrian drove somewhere he hadn't visited in nearly 15 years. His parents' house. Nothing had changed. The manicured hedges, the stone fountain, the polished black front doors. Even the butler greeted him with the same formal smile. "Welcome home, Mr. Caldwell." Home. The word still felt unfamiliar. His father was in the library reviewing financial reports. He looked up briefly. "Adrian, Dad, what brings you here?" "I wanted to ask you something." His father removed his reading glasses. "Go ahead." Adrian hesitated. "When something important happened in your life." "Yes? Who did you talk to?" His father frowned. "I handled it." "By yourself?" "Of course. Weren't you ever afraid?" The older man looked genuinely confused. "Afraid of what?" "Being honest." His father leaned back in his chair. "Honesty is useful when it benefits the situation." Adrian felt something sink inside him. "And when it doesn't? Then discretion is usually wiser." The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Yet Adrian walked away understanding more about himself than he had in years. He hadn't learned emotional distance on his own. He had inherited it. Children don't only inherit eye color. Sometimes they inherit ways of surviving. The tragedy is that survival strategies often become relationship problems in adulthood. That evening, Adrian stopped by a small neighborhood bookstore. Not because he intended to buy anything, because it was one of Jasmine's favorite places. She loved the quiet aisles. The smell of old pages, the handwritten staff recommendations tucked beneath novels. He wandered through the architecture section until an elderly employee approached him. "Looking for something specific?" Adrian smiled politely. "Not really." The man picked up a worn hardcover book about restoring historic homes. My wife loved this one. You've read it? He chuckled. Not a single page. Adrian laughed. Then why recommend it? Because I loved watching her talk about it. The old man smiled toward the shelves. She passed away 3 years ago. I'm sorry. Thank you. He gently brushed dust from the cover. You know what I miss most? Adrian shook his head. Not the big vacations. Not anniversaries. Not birthdays. He smiled sadly. I miss hearing about her day. Adrian swallowed quietly. The man continued. People think love disappears because of one terrible mistake. He looked Adrian directly in the eyes. Most of the time, it disappears because people slowly stop sharing ordinary things. Those words stayed with Adrian long after he left the bookstore. He realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd told Jasmine about something that frightened him, or disappointed him, or confused him. He had shared schedules, business, successes, travel plans, but not himself. He'd offered information, not vulnerability. There was a difference. And perhaps that difference had been quietly growing between them long before the restaurant. Just after sunset, Jasmine's phone buzzed. This time, she answered. Hello? There was a brief silence before Adrian spoke. Thank you. She closed her eyes. For what? For answering. Neither spoke for several seconds. It wasn't awkward. It was careful. Finally, Jasmine broke the silence. I don't want to argue. I don't either. I don't want excuses. You won't get any. Another pause. She took a slow breath. Saturday. What time? 10 in the morning. Where? Jasmine thought for a moment. Lincoln Park Conservatory. He sounded surprised. A greenhouse? Yes. Why there? She looked out her apartment window at the city lights. Because growing things deserve peaceful places. Adrian understood immediately. I'll be there. No matter what happens. She hesitated. Promise me one thing. Anything. Don't let today be the day you decide what you think I want to hear. His voice was steady. I promise. After they hung up, neither felt relieved. Neither felt hopeful. Not yet. But both felt something they hadn't experienced in days. Purpose. The conversation they had spent years unknowingly avoiding was finally approaching. And whether it ended their relationship, or became the beginning of a stronger one, would depend on something far more valuable than wealth, pride, or perfect timing. It would depend on two people finding the courage to tell the whole truth. Saturday morning arrived wrapped in a soft autumn mist, the kind that blurred the edges of Chicago's skyline without hiding it completely. Jasmine parked outside the Lincoln Park Conservatory 20 minutes early. She always arrived early when something mattered, not because she disliked waiting, because she liked collecting her thoughts before someone else's entered the room. She remained inside her car for several minutes, watching people drift toward the greenhouse. A young couple carried matching cups of coffee. An elderly man photographed bright orange leaves with an old camera. Parents guided excited children toward the entrance. Life moved peacefully around her. For a brief moment, she wondered if she should leave. One turn of the key. One press on the accelerator. She could drive away without hearing anything Adrian had to say. It would certainly be easier. But easy and right were rarely the same thing. She remembered something her grandmother often said. Courage isn't running toward the truth. It's refusing to run away from it. Jasmine turned off the engine. She stepped out of the car and walked toward the conservatory. Inside, warm air wrapped around her the moment the glass doors closed behind her. The scent of damp earth, orchids and tropical plants filled the greenhouse. Sunlight filtered through the enormous glass ceiling, creating moving patterns across stone walkways. Water trickled gently through a small indoor fountain. It was impossible to raise your voice in a place like this. Nature had a way of reminding people to slow down. Jasmine chose a wooden bench overlooking a collection of blooming lilies. She sat quietly. At exactly 10 o'clock, she heard familiar footsteps. She looked up. Adrian stood several feet away. For the first time since the restaurant, they faced each other. Neither smiled. Neither cried. Neither rushed forward. They simply looked at one another. Sometimes, seeing someone after emotional distance feels like meeting them for the first time. Adrian spoke first. Thank you for coming. Jasmine nodded. I said I would. He noticed she was wearing a simple cream-colored sweater instead of the elegant dresses she often wore to dinners. She noticed he'd left his expensive watch at home. Small details. Yet both silently recognized that neither had come to impress the other. They had come to tell the truth. For several moments, neither spoke again. Finally, Adrian broke the silence. I owe you an apology. Jasmine didn't interrupt. I lied. Another pause. I wasn't running late. No. You weren't. I was already inside. Yes. I know. The words hung gently between them. Adrian looked down. I should have told you before that meeting ever happened. You should have. I was afraid. Jasmine frowned slightly. Afraid of what? That you'd misunderstand. She held his gaze. And what happened instead? He gave a sad smile. You misunderstood. No. Her answer was calm. I understood exactly what your lie allowed me to understand. Those words hit him harder than anger would have. She wasn't accusing him of cheating. She was pointing to something deeper. His dishonesty had created a space where trust could no longer breathe. Adrian slowly sat on the opposite end of the bench, leaving respectful distance between them. I met Claire. I figured. My former fiancée. I guessed. It wasn't romantic. Jasmine remained quiet. I know that probably doesn't matter right now. It matters. He looked surprised. It does? She nodded. But it doesn't erase the lie. No, it doesn't. For the first time in years, Adrian resisted the urge to defend himself. Instead, he simply continued telling the truth. She contacted me 3 weeks earlier. She said she was moving overseas. She wanted to return old letters and photographs. The envelope you saw. Jasmine remembered it immediately. I almost cancelled. But I kept thinking. He hesitated. That if I told you I was meeting my former fiancée, you'd immediately imagine the worst. Jasmine looked at the lilies swaying gently beneath the greenhouse windows. You made that decision for me. He closed his eyes briefly. I know. You didn't trust me enough to let me decide how I'd respond. I know. You protected yourself from a conversation. I did. And created a much bigger one. Yes. Neither spoke for nearly a minute. The fountain continued flowing beside them. Somewhere deeper inside the conservatory, children laughed. Life continued. Jasmine finally asked the question that had lived inside her since the restaurant. Did you ever love her? Adrian answered immediately. Yes. The honesty surprised her. But not the way I loved the idea of making the relationship work. He continued. We wanted different lives. We kept pretending love alone could solve everything. It couldn't. So, we ended it. Jasmine listened quietly. Why keep the letters? I forgot they even existed. You never looked at them? They stayed in storage for years. She studied his face carefully. There was sadness, regret, but no hesitation. Truth often sounds different from rehearsed explanations. It carries pauses instead of perfection. Jasmine looked down at her hands. I need to tell you something too. He waited. When I saw you. She took a slow breath. I wanted to walk over. What stopped you? My childhood. He looked confused. She smiled sadly. When my parents fought. I learned that silence kept people calmer. So I left. You never even gave me the chance to explain. I know. She looked away. And that wasn't fair, either. Adrian blinked. You think you were unfair? I think. She searched for the right words. I protected myself so quickly that I never stopped to ask whether the truth might be more complicated. He leaned forward slightly. I would have told you. Eventually, the single word landed softly, but powerfully. She wasn't questioning whether he could tell the truth. She was questioning why it hadn't come first. A gardener carefully trimmed flowers several yards away. Watching him work reminded Jasmine of one of her restoration projects. She smiled faintly. You know something? What? When we're restoring old buildings, we never replace a damaged beam without first asking why it cracked. Adrian nodded. Otherwise. Oh, the whole beam breaks too. He finished her sentence. She smiled for the first time that morning. A relationship isn't very different. He looked around the greenhouse. I've spent my whole life fixing consequences. She waited. I've never been very good at fixing causes. That admission carried more weight than any apology. Because genuine change rarely begins with guilt. It begins with understanding. Jasmine stood and slowly walked toward a collection of towering palm trees. Adrian followed several steps behind, not beside her. Behind her, giving her space. She appreciated that more than he realized. After a while she stopped walking. Can I ask one last question? You can ask me anything. If I hadn't seen you that night. His heart sank. Would you have told me? The greenhouse suddenly felt impossibly quiet. Adrian didn't answer immediately, because there was only one truthful answer. I don't know. She closed her eyes. I wish I could say yes. I wish I could promise I would have. But... He swallowed hard. I honestly don't know. Jasmine nodded slowly. Ironically, that painful truth restored more trust than another comforting lie ever could. Because honesty isn't always reassuring. Sometimes it's simply real. Before leaving, they walked toward the conservatory exit together. Neither reached for the other's hand. Neither spoke about getting back together. Some wounds needed honesty before they could even begin healing. Outside, cool autumn air greeted them once again. Adrian stopped beside her car. I don't expect forgiveness today. You shouldn't. I'll wait. Jasmine looked at him carefully. No. He frowned. No? I don't want you to wait. He looked confused. I want you to grow. The words lingered between them. And I'll do the same. She smiled gently. If our paths meet again, let it be because we became healthier people. Not because we were afraid to be alone. Adrian felt tears threaten for the first time in years. He didn't hide them. I understand. Jasmine opened her car door. Before getting inside, she turned back one final time. You know what hurts most? What? Not that you met Claire. He listened carefully. It's that somewhere along the way. You stopped believing I was a safe place for your truth. She closed the door softly. As Adrian watched her drive away, he realized something that no business school, boardroom, or billion-dollar deal had ever taught him. Trust isn't built when someone tells you what you want to hear. It's built when they trust you enough to tell you what you're afraid to hear. And for the first time in his life, Adrian understood that emotional courage wasn't about winning difficult conversations. It was about having them before they became impossible. Neither of them knew what the future would hold, but both drove away carrying the same lesson. Silence had brought them to this moment. Only honesty could decide where they went next. The weeks that followed were quieter than either Jasmine or Adrian expected. Not because they had stopped thinking about each other, but because they had finally stopped chasing answers before they were ready to live them. For the first time since they met, there were no good morning texts. No shared dinner reservations. No spontaneous coffee dates. No late-night phone calls asking, "Have you eaten?" The silence felt different now. It wasn't punishment. It was space. And sometimes, space isn't what separates two people. It's what allows them to see themselves clearly. Jasmine threw herself into work, not to escape her emotions, to understand them. She accepted a restoration project, unlike any she'd handled before. A century-old public library on the south side of Chicago. The building had survived fires, floods, economic recessions, and decades of neglect. Yet, despite everything it had endured, its foundation remained remarkably strong. When Jasmine first stepped inside, sunlight poured through cracked stained glass windows, illuminating rows of empty bookshelves coated in years of dust. Her project manager, Luis Hernandez, handed her the inspection report. The roof needs replacing. The plumbing is outdated. Electrical systems are a disaster. He sighed. The city council is wondering if restoration is even worth the cost. Jasmine slowly walked through the main reading hall, running her fingertips gently across the worn wooden shelves. Then she smiled. They're asking the wrong question. Luis looked puzzled. What should they be asking? She turned toward him. They shouldn't ask how damaged the building is. She paused. They should ask whether the foundation still deserves saving. Luis looked around thoughtfully. And? Jasmine gently placed her hand against one of the original stone columns. The foundation is still here. So are the possibilities. Those words weren't just about a building anymore. Without realizing it, Jasmine had begun describing her own heart. The restoration team began work the following Monday. Young apprentices joined experienced craftsmen. Carpenters, electricians, engineers, and architects worked side by side. Every morning before work began, Jasmine gathered everyone together for a brief meeting. On the first day, she held up a loose brick that had fallen from one of the walls. What do you see? One apprentice answered quickly. A broken brick. Another shrugged. Construction waste. Jasmine smiled. I see history. Everyone looked confused. This brick has supported this building for nearly 100 years. It isn't useless. It simply needs to be cleaned, reinforced, and returned to where it belongs. A young intern named Sophie raised her hand. So, you don't replace everything that's damaged? Jasmine shook her head. No. We replace only what cannot safely be restored. She looked around at the entire team. The easiest solution isn't always the wisest one. The room fell quiet. Education often happens in unexpected places. Sometimes a lesson about architecture quietly becomes a lesson about life. Later that afternoon, Jasmine received a phone call from one of her former students, Ava, the same teenager who had nearly thrown away her first architectural sketch months earlier. "Ms. Carter?" "Hi, Ava. I got accepted." Jasmine smiled immediately. "Accepted where?" "The Illinois School of Architecture." "That's wonderful. I almost didn't apply." "Why?" "I kept thinking I wasn't good enough." Jasmine leaned back in her chair. "And what changed your mind?" Ava laughed softly. What did I do?" "You told me that every beautiful building starts as an imperfect sketch." Jasmine felt emotion rise unexpectedly. "I remembered that. I kept drawing. I kept improving. And I got in." After the call ended, Jasmine sat quietly in her office. Life has a remarkable way of returning our own words to us when we need them most. Maybe people aren't expected to become perfect overnight. Maybe healing works the same way as learning, one small improvement at a time. Across the city, Adrian Caldwell was learning very different lessons. The first thing he did after meeting Jasmine at the conservatory wasn't calling another executive meeting. It wasn't expanding another company. It wasn't escaping into work. Instead, he made an appointment with a therapist. The receptionist offered him an opening nearly 3 weeks later. Normally, Adrian would have asked for special treatment. This time, he accepted the wait. Healing, he realized, couldn't be rushed simply because he could afford to pay for it. His first session felt awkward. The therapist, Dr. Rebecca Monroe, welcomed him into a simple office with comfortable chairs and books lining every wall. Nothing about the room reflected power or wealth, and Adrian appreciated that. After introducing herself, Dr. Monroe smiled gently. "What brings you here?" Adrian answered with the sentence he'd rehearsed during the drive. "I almost lost someone I love." She nodded. "What happened?" "I lied." "What did you lie about?" "I told someone I was running late." She waited. "I wasn't." Silence. Then she asked a question so simple it caught him completely off guard. "Was that the first lie?" Adrian frowned. "What do you mean?" "The first spoken lie." She leaned forward slightly. "Or simply the first one someone noticed." He stared at the floor. For several seconds, he couldn't answer. Because, deep down, he knew the truth. The restaurant hadn't been the beginning. He'd spent years hiding fear. Stress, loneliness, pressure, disappointment. He rarely lied with words. He lied with omission. He presented a version of himself that never needed comfort, never struggled, never doubted. The restaurant had only exposed a habit that had existed for decades. "What did you learn about emotions growing up?" "Doctor," Monroe asked. Adrian smiled bitterly. "That successful people manage them privately." "And who taught you that?" "My father." "And did it make you emotionally healthy?" The question hung in the room. "No." "Did it make your relationship stronger?" "No." She nodded gently. "Then perhaps it isn't strength." He looked up. "Perhaps it's survival." She continued. "The problem with survival strategies is that children need them. Adults often don't." Those words settled deeply inside Adrian. He had built billion-dollar companies by questioning outdated systems. Yet he'd never questioned the emotional system he'd inherited from childhood. Not once, until now. A few days later, Adrian met Owen for lunch, not at an expensive restaurant. Just a small neighborhood diner they used to visit before either of them had money. The waitress recognized them immediately. "You boys haven't been here in years." Owen laughed. "We've been reminded not to forget where we started." She poured coffee into their mugs. "Good. Success changes people. If you let it." After she walked away, Owen looked across the table. "So, therapy?" Adrian nodded. "How's that going?" "It turns out." He smiled faintly. "I've spent 40 years answering the wrong questions." "What do you mean?" "I kept asking how to become successful. And I never asked how to become emotionally available." Owen laughed. "That's a much harder question." "It is. But I think it matters more." For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Owen said something Adrian would never forget. "You know, do what? Money can buy privacy. It can buy comfort. It can even buy influence." He stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "But it will never buy trust. You earn that. One honest conversation at a time." Adrian looked out the diner window at ordinary people beginning ordinary afternoons. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about stock prices, or acquisitions, or quarterly profits. He was thinking about becoming someone worthy of being trusted. Not because Jasmine had asked him to, because he finally understood that honesty wasn't something you offered only after getting caught. It was supposed to be the foundation everything else stood upon. And just like the century-old library Jasmine was restoring, he was beginning to realize that real restoration always starts below the surface, not where everyone can see it, but where everything else depends on it. By the beginning of November, nearly 6 weeks had passed since Jasmine and Adrian last saw each other at the conservatory. Neither had reached out. It wasn't because they had stopped caring. It was because, for the first time in their lives, both understood that healing couldn't be rushed by loneliness. Missing someone isn't always a reason to return. Sometimes it's simply evidence that what you shared mattered. The harder question is whether returning would help you grow, or merely help you avoid being alone. Jasmine's restoration of the old library had become the highlight of her career. Every day, more of the building came back to life. Workers carefully cleaned the original stone walls instead of covering them. Carpenters repaired century-old oak bookshelves by hand. Electricians modernized the wiring while preserving the building's historic character. One afternoon, Jasmine stood beside a cracked marble staircase with Luis. "It still bothers me," he admitted. "What does?" "The crack." She looked down. The fracture stretched several feet across the stone. "We can replace it." Jasmine shook her head. "No. But people will see it." "I hope they do." Luis frowned. "You want visitors to notice the damage?" "I want them to notice the repair." He looked puzzled. Jasmine smiled. "If we erase every scar, future generations will never know what this building survived." Luis stood quietly for a long moment. Then he smiled. "I don't think you're talking about architecture anymore." She laughed. "Maybe not." A local newspaper visited the construction site the following week. The reporter interviewed Jasmine while photographers documented the restoration. "What inspired this project?" the reporter asked. Jasmine looked around the historic reading room. "We live in a culture that often mistakes replacement for progress." She gently rested her hand against one of the restored bookshelves. "But sometimes, the strongest thing we can do is repair what still has a solid foundation." The reporter scribbled notes. "So this building represents hope?" Jasmine smiled. "I think it represents something even more important." "What?" "Patience." The photographer lowered his camera. "What do you mean?" "Everyone wants quick results." She looked toward workers, carefully restoring stained glass windows. "But meaningful restoration takes time. So does trust. So does healing. So does becoming the person you were meant to be." The room grew unexpectedly quiet. Even the construction crew paused for a moment. The reporter smiled. "I don't think our readers expected a life lesson." Jasmine laughed softly. That evening, after the article was published online, Adrian happened to see it while scrolling through local news. The headline read, "Architect preserves more than buildings. She restores hope." He recognized Jasmine immediately. There she was, wearing a yellow construction helmet, smiling beside the library's original entrance. He clicked the article. As he read her interview, one sentence stopped him. "Meaningful restoration takes time." He leaned back in his chair. She wasn't talking to him. She hadn't written those words for him. Yet somehow, they felt personal. For months, he'd wanted one thing, another chance. Now he realized something uncomfortable. A second chance given too early might only recreate the first failure. Growth required patience, not desperation. For the first time, he stopped wondering when Jasmine would forgive him. Instead, he asked himself a better question. If forgiveness came tomorrow, would I actually be ready for it? The honest answer surprised him. No, not yet. His weekly therapy sessions continued. During one appointment, Dr. Monroe placed 2 empty chairs facing each other. "I'd like you to imagine Jasmine sitting here." Adrian shifted uneasily. "What do I say?" "The truth." He looked at the empty chair. For several seconds, nothing came. Then quietly, "I'm sorry." Silence. "I didn't lie because I wanted another woman." Another pause. "I lied because I didn't know how to trust someone with the uncomfortable parts of my life." His voice cracked slightly. "I've spent so many years trying to look strong that I forgot strength isn't pretending to have no weaknesses." "Doctor." Monroe waited until he finished. Then she asked, "What do you think Jasmine needed most that day?" Adrian answered almost immediately. "Respect." She nodded. "And what creates respect?" He thought carefully. "Truth. Not polished truth. Not delayed truth. Simply truth." One Saturday afternoon, Adrian volunteered at a youth entrepreneurship program his company sponsored every year. Normally, he gave a 30-minute speech and left. This time, he stayed all day. He walked from table to table answering questions. helping teenagers improve business ideas, listening instead of lecturing. Toward the end of the workshop, a 16-year-old boy approached him. "Mr. Caldwell?" "Yes?" "Can I ask something that's not about business?" "Of course." "My dad says real men don't talk about feelings." Adrian froze. The words transported him instantly back to his own childhood. "What do you think?" he asked. The boy shrugged. "I don't know." Adrian smiled gently. "I used to believe that too." "You did?" "For a very long time." "So?" The boy hesitated. "Is my dad wrong?" Adrian chose his next words carefully. "I think your dad is probably teaching you what someone once taught him." The teenager looked thoughtful. "But that doesn't mean you have to carry every lesson into your future." The room grew quiet. Several nearby students stopped working and listened. Adrian continued. "It takes courage to build a successful business." He smiled warmly. "But it takes even greater courage to build healthy relationships." The students nodded. One girl quietly whispered, "I wish more adults said that." So did Adrian, because perhaps fewer hearts would break if emotional honesty were taught as carefully as financial success. Meanwhile, Jasmine's grandmother invited her over for Sunday dinner. The house smelled of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and cinnamon pie. Marcus was there too, now 30 years old, married, father of 2 energetic little girls. Watching her nieces race through the living room made Jasmine smile. Children still found joy so easily. During dessert, Marcus looked across the table. "So?" Jasmine laughed. "What? You've been unusually quiet lately." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Careful. That's her favorite hiding place." Everyone laughed. Jasmine shook her head. "I'm working through some things." Marcus nodded. "Can I tell you something?" "Always. When Emma and I got married." He smiled toward his wife in the kitchen. "We made one rule." "What rule?" "No difficult conversation waits until tomorrow." Jasmine looked interested. "Really?" "If something hurts, we talk. If something scares us, we talk. If we're angry, we talk." He shrugged. "Some nights, those conversations last 5 minutes. Some nights 2 hours. But we promised ourselves we'd never let silence make decisions for us." Jasmine felt tears sting her eyes, not because she was sad, because she realized something beautiful. Healthy communication wasn't something people magically understood. It was something they practiced, every single day. That evening, driving home through the glowing streets of Chicago, Jasmine reflected on everything she'd learned over the past several weeks. From the library, from her grandmother, from Marcus, from her students. Every lesson seemed connected. Buildings required maintenance before collapsing. Friendships required honesty before resentment grew. Families required conversation before misunderstandings hardened into distance. Love required courage long before crisis arrived. As she stopped at a red light, her phone buzzed through the car's Bluetooth system. A calendar reminder appeared on the dashboard. Library grand reopening 6 weeks away. She smiled. The building was almost ready. Its foundation had survived. Its walls had been repaired. Its history remained visible. Its future looked hopeful. For reasons she couldn't fully explain, she whispered to herself, "I hope people can heal like that." Across town, almost at the exact same moment, Adrian stood on the balcony of his apartment, overlooking Lake Michigan. The cold November wind swept across the water. For the first time in many years, he wasn't thinking about what he'd lost. He was thinking about who he was becoming, and though neither of them knew it yet, life was quietly preparing to bring their paths together once more. Not through coincidence, not through grand romance, but through the very thing that had begun changing both of them from the inside out. Growth. Because sometimes love doesn't return when 2 people miss each other. It returns only after they become capable of loving each other better than before. Before we continue, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe people can truly change after making a painful mistake? Or do you think some broken trust can never be repaired? Share your answer in the comments below. Your story or perspective might encourage someone else who is quietly struggling with the same question. If this story is touching your heart and reminding you of the importance of honesty, growth, and second chances, please take a moment to like this video. Subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, and share it with someone who believes that real love isn't about finding perfect people. It's about becoming better people. Don't go anywhere, because in the next chapter, fate quietly brings Jasmine and Adrian back into each other's world in a way neither of them expected. Their next meeting won't be filled with accusations or dramatic confessions, but with something far more powerful, undeniable evidence of how much they've both changed. The first snowfall arrived the same week the old library reopened. Chicago looked different beneath a blanket of fresh white snow. The busy streets seemed quieter. Traffic slowed. Children abandoned sidewalks to build snowmen in neighborhood parks. For Jasmine Carter, the city felt as though it had paused just long enough for everyone to notice how beautiful ordinary moments could be. 6 months earlier, she would have rushed through the morning without looking up. Now she found herself appreciating small things. The sound of snow crunching beneath her boots. Steam rising from a paper coffee cup. The way strangers smiled at one another after helping push a stalled car through the snow. Healing hadn't made life perfect. It had simply made her present. The grand reopening of the Southside Public Library drew a larger crowd than anyone expected. Teachers, students, city officials, local reporters, families who had grown up visiting the building decades earlier. The mayor stood near the entrance, preparing for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Children pressed their faces against the restored stained-glass windows, fascinated by the colorful reflections dancing across the polished floors. Jasmine quietly remained in the background. She had never enjoyed being the center of attention. Louise noticed immediately. "You know they're looking for you. They'll find me eventually. They want the architect." She smiled. "The building deserves the attention." Louise laughed. "You really mean that?" "I do. If people leave today remembering the library instead of me, I've done my job." He shook his head. "You've always been different." Jasmine smiled. "No. I've just learned that lasting things don't need applause." The ceremony began shortly after 10 o'clock. The mayor thanked everyone involved in the restoration. He praised the construction workers, the engineers, the preservation committee. Finally, he invited Jasmine to say a few words. The applause made her slightly uncomfortable. She stepped toward the podium, looked around the beautifully restored reading hall, and smiled warmly. "When I first walked into this building..." She paused. "Many people saw damage." She rested one hand gently on the restored wooden podium. "I saw history. I saw resilience. I saw something worth saving." Several audience members nodded. Jasmine continued. "This library taught me an important lesson." She looked toward a group of high school students seated in the front row. "Strong foundations can survive incredible hardship." She smiled. "But only if someone is willing to repair them with patience, honesty, and care." Silence filled the room. Not awkward silence. Thoughtful silence. The same is true for people. The audience applauded. Jasmine stepped away from the microphone, feeling unexpectedly emotional. She hadn't planned to speak about life. Yet, somehow, the building had become its own metaphor. After the ceremony ended, guests wandered through the restored library admiring the renovations. Children explored colorful reading rooms. Older visitors searched for books they'd once borrowed decades earlier. Near one of the restored fireplaces, Ava approached Jasmine carrying a bouquet of flowers. "You did it." Jasmine hugged her. "We all did." Ava smiled. "I start architecture school next month." "I heard." "I'm terrified." Jasmine laughed softly. "Good." Ava looked confused. "Good? It means you care." She adjusted the flowers in Ava's hands. "The day you stop feeling nervous about something meaningful is the day you stop growing." Ava smiled thoughtfully. "I remember that. You've said that before. And you proved you mean it." Meanwhile, across the city, Adrian Caldwell sat inside another therapy session. Dr. Monroe placed a notebook on the table between them. "I have something I'd like you to try." He looked down. "A journal?" She nodded. "Every evening, I want you to write one honest thing you felt that day." Adrian smiled awkwardly. "That sounds surprisingly difficult." "It usually is." He picked up the notebook. "What if nothing interesting happens?" She laughed. "Honesty doesn't have to be interesting. It just has to be honest." He nodded slowly. "I can do that." She leaned forward. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "If Jasmine never comes back?" The room became very quiet. "Will the work you're doing still matter?" Adrian didn't answer immediately. Months earlier, his answer would have been no. Everything he'd done had been driven by the hope of winning her back. Now, he looked at the notebook in his hands, before quietly replying, "Yes." Dr. Monroe smiled. "Why?" "Because, he searched carefully for the words. "I finally like the person I'm becoming." For the first time since beginning therapy, she saw confidence that wasn't built on achievement. It was built on self-awareness. That kind of confidence lasts much longer. That afternoon, Adrian left his office early and walked through Millennium Park. No security detail, no assistants, no scheduled meetings. Just a man taking a long walk through his own city. He passed families skating beneath holiday lights. Street musicians played cheerful Christmas songs despite the cold. Vendors sold roasted chestnuts and hot chocolate. Life carried on around him. He noticed things he'd ignored for years. A father patiently teaching his daughter how to ice skate. Two elderly friends laughing while feeding birds. A young couple arguing quietly before stopping to apologize to each other. Relationships weren't perfect. Healthy ones simply refused to let pride stay louder than love. As Adrian crossed the pedestrian bridge, he noticed a small crowd gathered around a community bulletin board. Curious, he walked closer. A newspaper clipping had been pinned to the center. It featured a familiar photograph. Jasmine, standing proudly inside the restored library. The headline caught his attention immediately. Architect reminds Chicago that strong foundations deserve second chances. He smiled. Several strangers nearby discussed the article. One woman pointed toward the photograph. I heard she refused to replace half the building. Her husband nodded. Apparently, she said, repairing something valuable is harder than starting over. The woman smiled. I like that. So do I. Adrian quietly stepped away before anyone recognized him. He wasn't smiling because Jasmine had become successful. She already was. He smiled because she hadn't allowed pain to harden her heart. She was still teaching people to believe in restoration, still inspiring strangers, still making the world gentler than she found it. Some people become bitter after heartbreak. Others become wiser. Jasmine had somehow become both stronger and softer. That evening, Adrian opened the notebook Dr. Monroe had given him. He wrote the date, then stared at the blank page. After several minutes, he finally began writing. Today's honest thought. For the first time in my life, I don't want another chance, because I'm lonely. He paused, then continued. I want another chance, only if I can become the kind of man who deserves it. He closed the notebook, smiled quietly, and placed it on his bedside table. Growth, he realized, wasn't measured by how much someone missed the past. It was measured by how prepared they were to build a healthier future. He had no idea that future was already moving closer than he imagined. Because before the week ended, life would arrange a meeting neither he nor Jasmine had planned. Not at a restaurant, not in a greenhouse, but in a place where both of them would discover that the greatest changes are often recognized not by the people who experience them, but by the strangers quietly watching from the outside. 3 days after the library reopening, Chicago hosted its annual Winter Community Leadership Summit. Unlike glamorous charity galas filled with celebrities and television cameras, this event celebrated people who quietly improved their communities. Teachers, firefighters, volunteer organizations, small business owners, youth mentors, architects, entrepreneurs. The ballroom of the historic Palmer House Hotel buzzed with warm conversation rather than social competition. People weren't there to impress one another. They were there to celebrate service. Neither Jasmine nor Adrian knew the other had been invited. Jasmine almost declined. She disliked public recognition. When the invitation first arrived, she'd placed it inside a drawer and forgotten about it. It was her assistant, Elena, who convinced her otherwise. You have to go. Jasmine looked up from her drawings. I really don't. Yes, you do. I'd rather stay here. Elena folded her arms. You've spent 6 months reminding everyone else that their work matters. She smiled. Let someone remind you. Jasmine laughed. You're impossible. I've been called worse. After several seconds of thoughtful silence, Jasmine nodded. Fine. Elena grinned triumphantly. I already knew you'd say yes. You bought the ticket before asking me, didn't you? Maybe. Both women laughed. Sometimes good friends don't push us because they enjoy winning. They push us because they refuse to let fear quietly shrink our lives. Across town, Adrian received the same encouragement, only from Owen. You should go. I hate award dinners. I know. They're awkward. I know. They last forever. I know. Owen smiled. So I'm still not going. Owen reached across Adrian's desk and placed the invitation directly on top of his laptop. This one is different. Adrian sighed. How? Nobody cares how much money you have. They care what kind of person you've become. That answer lingered in the room. Finally, Adrian picked up the invitation. I'll think about it. Owen smiled knowingly. Which means, yes. Friday evening arrived with another light snowfall. Inside the hotel ballroom, soft jazz music floated through the room while guests greeted one another beneath crystal chandeliers. Jasmine entered quietly wearing a simple navy blue evening gown. Elegant, graceful, unpretentious. She greeted several fellow architects before finding her assigned table near the center of the ballroom. As she sat down, she noticed the seat across from her remained empty. She thought nothing of it. People were still arriving. 10 minutes later, the ballroom doors opened once again. Adrian stepped inside. His tuxedo was perfectly tailored as always. Yet, something about him looked different. Not wealthier. Not more successful. Simply lighter. His eyes searched the room while an event coordinator approached him. "This way, Mr. Caldwell." He followed her through rows of decorated tables, then stopped. Table 12. His assigned seat, directly across from Jasmine. For one suspended moment, neither of them moved. Jasmine slowly looked up. Their eyes met. The noise of the ballroom seemed to disappear. Neither smiled immediately. Neither looked away. There was no dramatic music, no shocked expressions. Just two people, quietly realizing that life had arranged another meeting before either of them felt completely ready. The coordinator looked between them. "Oh." She laughed nervously. "You two know each other?" Jasmine answered first. "Yes." Adrian nodded. "We do." The coordinator smiled, completely unaware of the history sitting at her table. "Wonderful. I'll let you both catch up." She walked away. Neither spoke. Finally, Adrian gently pulled out his chair. "May I?" Jasmine nodded. "Of course." For several minutes, they listened to the opening remarks without saying a word. Oddly enough, the silence no longer felt painful. It felt respectful, almost peaceful. When applause filled the ballroom after the first speaker finished, Adrian quietly turned toward Jasmine. "Congratulations." She looked surprised. "For the library. You read about it?" "I did." She smiled. "Thank you." Another pause. "I also heard your speech." She frowned slightly. "You were there?" "No." He smiled faintly. "I watched the recording online." She laughed softly. "I didn't know they recorded it." "They did. What did you think?" Adrian looked at her with genuine admiration. "I think Chicago is fortunate to have someone who sees value in things other people are ready to throw away." Jasmine looked down for a moment. "That's a generous compliment." "It's an honest one." Dinner was served. The conversation remained light. Architecture. Books. The unusually early snowfall. Neither mentioned the restaurant. Neither mentioned Claire. Neither mentioned the conservatory. Some conversations deserve their own time. This wasn't it. Across the table, Jasmine noticed something unexpected. Adrian listened differently now. He no longer interrupted with solutions. He asked questions, waited, actually listened to the answers. Small changes often reveal the biggest growth. Halfway through dinner, the evening's keynote speaker stepped onto the stage. His name was Professor Harold Bennett, a retired educator who had spent 40 years mentoring disadvantaged youth. He smiled warmly at the audience. "I've been asked to speak about leadership." He paused. "But leadership isn't what interests me most." The room grew quiet. "What interests me is character." He looked around the ballroom. "Do you know how character grows?" Several people shook their heads. "It grows every time someone chooses what is right over what is easy." He smiled. "That choice is usually invisible. No cameras, no applause, no trophies. Just one quiet decision." Jasmine glanced toward Adrian. He was listening with complete attention. The professor continued. "I've met brilliant people who lacked integrity. I've met wealthy people who lacked kindness. And I've met ordinary people whose honesty made everyone around them extraordinary." The ballroom erupted into applause. Jasmine felt something shift inside her. Growth wasn't measured by perfection. It was measured by repeated choices, repeated honesty, repeated courage. Later in the evening, guests were invited to mingle. Jasmine wandered toward a display honoring community volunteers. She paused to examine photographs from local projects. Moments later, someone joined her. Adrian. Neither seemed surprised. He stood beside her, hands resting comfortably in his pockets. After a quiet moment, he spoke. "I started keeping a journal." She looked at him. "Really?" He nodded. "My therapist suggested it." The word therapist caught her attention. "You've been seeing someone?" "For several months." Jasmine didn't respond immediately, not because therapy surprised her, because he said it so naturally, without embarrassment, without trying to appear strong. That alone told her something had changed. "What have you learned?" He smiled thoughtfully. "That I spent most of my life confusing emotional control with emotional health." She looked toward the photographs again. "And now?" "Now I'm learning they're not the same thing." She smiled gently. "I think that's a lesson a lot of people need." "So do I." The evening ended with guests slowly making their way toward the hotel entrance. Snowflakes drifted lazily beneath the streetlights. Jasmine wrapped her coat tightly around herself. As she reached the sidewalk, she realized she'd forgotten her gloves inside. "I'll be right back," she murmured. Before she could turn around, Adrian held out a familiar pair of dark leather gloves. "You left these on your chair." She smiled. "Thank you." Their hands brushed briefly as she accepted them. Months earlier, that tiny touch would have carried unbearable emotion. Now, it simply felt warm, comfortable, hopeful, not because everything had been repaired, because neither of them was pretending it had. Adrian looked toward the softly falling snow. "I won't keep you." Jasmine nodded. "Good night, Adrian." "Good night, Jasmine." She took a few steps before hearing him call softly. "Jasmine?" She turned. "I meant what I said." "About what?" "You deserve honesty." She held his gaze for several seconds, then smiled. "I know. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was something quieter. Recognition." She could finally see the difference between the man who had lied in that restaurant and the man now standing beneath the falling snow. Real change doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself through countless small choices made consistently over time. As Jasmine drove home, she realized she wasn't wondering whether Adrian had changed. She was wondering something much more important, whether they had both changed enough to someday build something stronger than what they had lost. And for the first time since that unforgettable night at Le Marais, the future no longer felt frightening. It simply felt unwritten. Winter settled comfortably over Chicago. The city moved at a gentler pace. Coffee shops stayed busy. Bookstores filled with people, escaping the cold. Parks became quieter, their walking paths covered in fresh snow. Nearly 3 weeks passed after the Community Leadership Summit. Neither Jasmine nor Adrian forced another meeting. But something had changed. The silence between them no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a bridge that was slowly being built. Not crossed. Built. One honest moment at a time. On the first Saturday of January, Jasmine received a text message. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It simply read, "There's a new history exhibit at the Chicago Architecture Center. I remember how much you enjoy restored buildings. If you'd ever like to see it, I'd enjoy your company. No pressure. Adrian." Jasmine read the message twice. Then she smiled, not because he'd invited her somewhere, because he'd given her something he rarely offered in the past. A choice. No assumptions. No expectations. Just an invitation. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she made breakfast, read several chapters of a novel, watered her plants. Only after she'd finished her morning routine did she reply. "Saturday, 11 a.m. Thank you for asking instead of assuming." Less than a minute later, Adrian replied, "I'm learning." Those 2 words carried more meaning than a dozen romantic speeches. Growth often sounds surprisingly simple. Saturday morning arrived bright and cold. The Chicago Architecture Center overlooked the river, its modern glass walls reflecting winter sunlight. Families wandered through exhibits. College students studied architectural models. Tourists photographed skyline displays. Jasmine arrived first. She smiled to herself. Some habits never changed. 5 minutes later, Adrian walked through the entrance carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I remembered." He handed one to her. "Oat milk. 1 sugar." She laughed softly. "You still remember?" "I remember a lot." She accepted the coffee. "Thank you." No awkward hug. No unnecessary tension. Just 2 people quietly choosing kindness. They spent nearly an hour exploring the exhibits. Miniature city models. Historic blueprints. Interactive displays explaining how Chicago rebuilt itself after the Great Fire. Jasmine paused in front of an exhibit showing photographs taken immediately after the fire of 1871. Entire neighborhoods reduced to ashes. One caption caught her attention. "Chicago became stronger because people rebuilt with better foundations than before." She stared at those words for several seconds. Adrian noticed. "Interesting?" She nodded. "Very." He read the caption, then smiled. The city didn't pretend the fire never happened. No. It learned from it. Jasmine looked at him. Exactly. She wasn't talking about Chicago anymore. Neither of them was. Later, they found themselves standing before a large display illustrating structural engineering failures. One photograph showed a bridge that had collapsed decades earlier. The explanation underneath described a single overlooked crack that gradually weakened the entire structure. Jasmine folded her arms thoughtfully. That's how relationships fail too. Adrian looked at her. "One big mistake?" She shook her head. "No." She pointed toward the photograph. "One small crack. Well, that nobody thinks is serious enough to repair." He remained quiet. Finally, he nodded. "I think ours started long before the restaurant." She looked surprised. "You do?" I do. They found 2 empty chairs overlooking the river through the building's enormous windows. Outside, snow drifted gently across the water. Inside, warm sunlight filled the room. For several minutes, neither spoke. Finally, Adrian broke the silence. I've been thinking a lot. Jasmine smiled faintly. That sounds dangerous. He laughed. I deserve that. Another quiet moment passed. I don't think the restaurant ended our relationship. Jasmine listened carefully. I think... He searched for the right words. It exposed one. We'd slowly stopped building. She looked out toward the river. I've been thinking something similar. You have? She nodded. We became experts at avoiding uncomfortable conversations. He smiled sadly. We called it peace. We did. But peace isn't the absence of conflict. She looked at him. It's the presence of honesty. Adrian slowly nodded. I wish I'd understood that years ago. For the next hour, they talked, not about blame, about patterns. Jasmine spoke first. When my parents argued. She looked down at her coffee. I promised myself I'd never become someone who started fights. Adrian listened without interrupting. So, whenever something bothered me, I convinced myself it wasn't important. He nodded slowly. I noticed. You did? I just didn't understand why. She smiled sadly. I didn't either. She took another sip of coffee. I thought keeping quiet protected love. It doesn't. No. It protects comfort. The words lingered between them. Education often begins when we finally recognize the difference between comfort and health. Comfort avoids difficult conversations. Health welcomes them. Adrian took a slow breath. My turn. She nodded. When I was 12, my father told me something after I lost a baseball game. What? He said. Adrian looked toward the river. People only respect winners. Jasmine frowned. That's a heavy thing to tell a child. I believed him. For almost 30 years. He laughed quietly. So every time I felt uncertain, I hid it. Every time I made a mistake, I tried to fix it before anyone noticed. And every time I was afraid, I pretended I wasn't. Jasmine looked at him for a long moment. You must have been exhausted. He smiled. I was. Neither spoke again for several seconds. Sometimes the most compassionate response isn't advice. It's understanding. Nearby, a father helped his young son assemble a miniature bridge from wooden blocks at an educational station. The little boy accidentally knocked the structure over. He looked up nervously. I'm sorry. His father smiled warmly. What did we learn? The child looked at the broken pieces. That I need stronger support. Exactly. Together, they began rebuilding. Jasmine watched quietly, then smiled. Children, she thought, often receive the lessons adults spend years trying to relearn. Failure isn't the end. Ignoring the lesson is. She glanced toward Adrian. I think we're finally asking better questions. He looked at her. What questions? She smiled gently. Not, can we fix what broke? He waited. But what allowed it to break in the first place? Adrian looked back toward the father and son rebuilding their bridge. Then he nodded. I think that's the most important conversation we've ever had. Jasmine agreed. Not because they had solved everything, because they had finally stopped discussing symptoms and started understanding causes. And sometimes, that is where true healing quietly begins. Neither Jasmine nor Adrian noticed how much time had passed. Outside, the afternoon sky had shifted to a pale winter blue. Inside the Chicago Architecture Center, families slowly filtered out as the lunchtime crowds grew. For the first time in years, they weren't talking to defend themselves. They weren't trying to win. They weren't searching for the perfect response. They were simply listening. And listening, they were discovering, required just as much courage as speaking. Jasmine looked down at the empty coffee cup in her hands. Can I tell you something I've never told anyone? Adrian nodded immediately. You never have to ask permission. She smiled faintly. I think I do. He looked confused. Why? Because I spent so many years talking only when people expected me to. He didn't interrupt. She took a slow breath. When my parents divorced, I blamed myself. Adrian's expression softened. You were a child. I know that now. But children don't think like adults. She looked toward the snowy river outside the glass windows. I kept wondering if I'd been quieter. Or more helpful. Or a better daughter. Maybe they would have stayed together. Her voice cracked. It took years before I realized that children aren't responsible for fixing adult relationships. Adrian felt his chest tighten. No wonder she'd spent her life trying to keep the peace. She had been carrying a burden that never belonged to her. I'm so sorry, Jasmine. She looked at him. Thank you. Not because his apology could change her childhood. Because someone had finally acknowledged her pain without trying to explain it away. Sometimes, healing begins the moment someone says, "You shouldn't have carried that alone." Adrian remained quiet for several moments. Then he spoke. I've never told anyone this either. Jasmine gave him her full attention. When I was 26, my company almost failed. She looked surprised. I didn't know that. Very few people do. He smiled sadly. We were 3 weeks away from bankruptcy. My business partners wanted to tell everyone. What did you do? I told them no. Why? Because I thought struggling meant failing. He laughed bitterly. I spent weeks pretending everything was under control. Were you scared? I was terrified. He looked directly at her. But I thought fear made me look weak. She slowly shook her head. No, it made you human. He smiled. I know that now. But I wish someone had told me 20 years earlier. The conversation paused as a tour group walked past. A guide pointed toward a display explaining how engineers inspect bridges. Bridges don't collapse overnight, she told the group. They fail after years of tiny stresses that go unnoticed. Jasmine and Adrian exchanged a quiet glance. Neither needed to say anything. The lesson wasn't about bridges anymore. A few minutes later, they walked toward a balcony overlooking the Chicago River. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the cold air. Below them, people hurried across the bridge carrying shopping bags and steaming cups of coffee. The city continued moving, unaware that 2 lives were quietly changing above it. Jasmine leaned lightly against the railing. Do you know what surprised me most these last few months? What? I wasn't lonely. Adrian looked at her. I missed you. She smiled gently. But I wasn't lonely. He nodded slowly. I understand. I finally realized something. She turned toward him. I don't need another person to complete my life. I want someone to share it with. He smiled. There's a huge difference. There is. He looked out across the river. I learned something similar. What? For years. I thought providing for people was the same as being emotionally available. She listened quietly. I could solve financial problems. I could create opportunities. I could protect people. He laughed softly. But I had no idea how to simply sit beside someone who was hurting. Jasmine's eyes warmed. You've gotten better. You noticed? I did. They stood together in comfortable silence. Not the silence that hides. The silence that breathes. Eventually, Adrian reached into the inside pocket of his coat. Jasmine noticed the movement. He carefully removed a small folded sheet of paper. I brought something. She looked curious. What is it? My therapist asked me to write a letter. He smiled awkwardly. She said I didn't have to give it to you. You don't. I know. He looked at the paper. But I'd like to. He handed it to her. Jasmine accepted it carefully. I won't read it now. He seemed relieved. Thank you. I'd rather give your words the attention they deserve. He smiled. You always respected important things. No, she corrected gently. I've learned to. As they left the architecture center, they walked toward the nearby Riverwalk. Neither seemed eager to end the afternoon. Street vendors sold hot chocolate beneath small wooden booths decorated with winter lights. Children laughed while tossing snowballs. Musicians performed holiday songs despite the freezing temperature. Adrian stopped beside a small bench overlooking the water. Can I ask you something? You can. Do you think people really change? Jasmine didn't answer immediately. Instead, she watched an elderly couple walking hand in hand. The man moved slowly with the help of a cane. Every few steps, his wife quietly matched his pace. She never rushed him, never complained, simply walked beside him. Finally, Jasmine spoke. I think people change every day. Adrian looked at her. The real question is whether they choose to keep changing after nobody's watching. He followed her gaze toward the elderly couple. I've been thinking about that a lot. I know. How? She smiled. Because you're no longer trying to convince me. He frowned slightly. What do you mean? The Adrian I met 2 years ago would have spent this entire afternoon proving he deserved another chance. She looked directly into his eyes. You didn't. He stayed quiet. You spent today understanding yourself instead. A gentle smile spread across his face. I guess therapy is working. She laughed. I guess it is. The afternoon slowly came to an end. They returned to the parking lot, where their cars were parked several spaces apart. Neither wanted to rush the goodbye. Adrian finally broke the silence. I'd like to keep seeing you. Jasmine didn't respond immediately. Not because she was unsure, because she wanted to answer honestly. I'd like that too. Hope flickered quietly across his face. But... He nodded. I know. She smiled. No relationship. He looked surprised. Not yet. She continued. I'd like friendship. Conversation. Time. Consistency. He listened carefully. I don't want us to fall back in love because we miss who we used to be. She took a slow breath. I want us to discover whether we can build something healthier than we ever had before. Adrian smiled. I think that's the wisest thing anyone has ever said to me. She laughed softly. I've had a lot of time to think. So have I. He extended his hand. Friends? She looked at it for a moment, then gently shook it. Friends. Neither of them realized how symbolic that simple handshake truly was. Months earlier, they would have embraced without understanding each other. Now, they chose patience over passion, understanding before romance, friendship before forever. Sometimes the strongest relationships aren't rebuilt with dramatic declarations of love. They're rebuilt one honest conversation, one consistent action, and one quiet promise at a time. As Jasmine drove home that evening, Adrian's unopened letter rested safely inside her purse. She hadn't read a single word, yet somehow, she already knew what mattered most. Not what was written on the pages, but the man who had finally become brave enough to write them. And before either of them knew it, that letter would become the final piece of a story that had begun with 3 words sent in a lie, and was slowly being rewritten through a lifetime of truth. Jasmine didn't read Adrian's letter that night. She placed it carefully inside the top drawer of her nightstand, and went about her evening exactly as she always did. She watered her plants, folded the blanket on her couch, prepared tomorrow's lunch before going to bed. The letter remained untouched. Not because she was avoiding it, because some words deserve an undistracted heart. There was a difference. For years, Jasmine had rushed difficult conversations. Either she avoided them completely, or she forced herself through them before she understood her own feelings. This time, she wanted to be intentional. Healing had taught her that timing matters. Not every truth needs to be spoken immediately, but every important truth deserves to be heard completely. The following Sunday morning, sunlight streamed through her apartment windows. Chicago looked unusually peaceful after a night of fresh snow. Jasmine brewed coffee, wrapped herself in a soft blanket, and finally opened Adrian's letter. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. Just like him. She began reading. Dear Jasmine, if you're reading this, thank you. Not because you owe me your time, but because I know trust is expensive, and you're choosing to spend a little of it on these pages. I spent weeks wondering how to explain the restaurant. Then I realized something. Explaining one night isn't enough, because that night wasn't our real problem. Our real problem was that I built a relationship where honesty arrived only after something went wrong. You deserved honesty before that. I didn't understand that then. I do now. I also want to apologize for something I didn't even know I was doing. I expected you to believe I was trustworthy without giving you the transparency that trust requires. Looking back, that wasn't fair. Thank you for showing me that emotional courage isn't pretending to have everything together. It's allowing someone to see the parts of you that still need work, whether our future is together or apart. Meeting you changed the kind of man I want to become, and for that, I will always be grateful. Adrian. Jasmine lowered the letter slowly. She noticed something remarkable. Not once had Adrian asked for another chance. Not once had he tried to persuade her. He had simply accepted responsibility. True apologies don't negotiate. They acknowledge. She folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope. A quiet smile crossed her face. Growth, she realized, had changed both of them. Months ago, she would have searched every sentence for hidden motives. Now she simply recognized sincerity. That afternoon, Jasmine visited her grandmother. Margaret was pruning rose bushes in the backyard, despite the cold weather. You picked a chilly day for gardening. Margaret laughed. Roses don't wait for perfect weather. Jasmine bent down to help gather trimmed branches. I finally read his letter. Margaret looked up. And? It was honest. How did it make you feel? Jasmine thought for a long moment. Peaceful. Not excited? No. Not confused? No. Margaret smiled knowingly. That's usually a good sign. Jasmine looked curious. Why? Because healthy love brings clarity more often than confusion. She carefully tied one of the rose stems to a wooden support. When I was young, I thought love was supposed to feel dramatic. She laughed softly. Your grandfather taught me something different. What? The strongest love usually feels calm. Jasmine looked around the quiet garden. I think I'm beginning to understand that. Over the next several weeks, Jasmine and Adrian slowly built a new rhythm. There were no extravagant dates, no declarations about destiny, no promises they weren't ready to make. Instead, there were ordinary moments. On Tuesday evenings, they met at a neighborhood bookstore. Each chose a book the other had never read. Then they spent an hour discussing it over coffee. Sometimes they agreed, sometimes they didn't. The important part wasn't winning. It was learning to disagree without withdrawing. One evening, Adrian recommended a biography of a famous entrepreneur. Jasmine finished reading it before their next meeting. I didn't like it. Adrian laughed. I suspected you might not. The author acted as if success justified ignoring everyone around him. It bothered me too. Jasmine smiled. The old you would have defended him. He nodded. The old me probably would have admired him. They both laughed. Growth has a quiet way of changing the people we choose to admire. Another Saturday, they volunteered together at the same community architecture program where Jasmine mentored students. Adrian wasn't there as a billionaire. He wore jeans, sneakers, and an old winter coat. Most of the teenagers had no idea who he was. They simply knew him as Mr. Adrian. A young student named Caleb struggled to present his business idea. I keep messing up. Adrian smiled. Good. The teenager frowned. Good? Every successful presentation I've ever given was built on mistakes I made during practice. Caleb looked surprised. You still make mistakes? Adrian laughed. Every week. The room filled with laughter. Jasmine watched from across the classroom. Months earlier, Adrian would have been uncomfortable admitting imperfection in front of strangers. Now, he spoke about it naturally, without embarrassment, without shame. Education isn't only about the lessons we teach. It's also about the example we choose to become. As the afternoon ended, Ava pulled Jasmine aside. Can I ask you something? Always. She glanced toward Adrian, who was helping students clean up art supplies. Is he? She hesitated. The same person you used to talk about. Jasmine followed her gaze. Yes. Ava looked genuinely confused. He seems different. Jasmine smiled softly. He is. People really can change. They can, but only when they decide growth is more important than protecting their pride. Ava nodded thoughtfully. I hope I remember that. I think you will. That evening, Jasmine and Adrian walked toward the parking lot together. The winter sun was beginning to set, painting the Chicago skyline with soft shades of gold and orange. Neither hurried to leave. Adrian broke the comfortable silence. You know. What? I don't spend much time thinking about the restaurant anymore. Jasmine looked at him. Neither do I. He smiled. I think that's because... He searched for the right words. We stopped living in that night. She nodded. We started building new days instead. They stood quietly watching the sunset. Trust, Jasmine realized, wasn't returning because they kept discussing the past. It was returning because every ordinary day gave them another opportunity to choose honesty. Grand gestures may begin romances, but ordinary consistency is what keeps them alive. Neither of them noticed it yet, but somewhere between shared books, student workshops, coffee conversations, and quiet walks through the city, something beautiful had begun growing again. Not the relationship they had lost. Something stronger, something wiser, something built on a foundation neither of them had possessed the first time they fell in love. And, before winter gave way to spring, life would ask them one final question, not whether they loved each other, but whether they trusted the people they had both become. By the time February arrived, Chicago had settled into the quiet rhythm of winter. Snowbanks lined neighborhood streets. Coffee shops stayed full. Bookstores smelled of fresh paper and cinnamon. The city had become a place of small routines. So had Jasmine and Adrian. Every Thursday evening, they met at the same cafe overlooking the river. They never officially planned it. It simply happened. The waitress eventually stopped asking if they wanted menus. She already knew. 2 coffees. 1 herbal tea. 1 slice of lemon cake. 2 forks. Not because they couldn't afford 2 desserts, because sharing had quietly become one of their traditions again. The difference was, this time, nothing felt rushed. One Thursday, as they sat near the window watching snowflakes drift across the river, Adrian placed his phone face down on the table. Jasmine noticed immediately. He smiled. I've been trying something new. What? I don't keep my phone in my hand during conversations anymore. She laughed softly. I remember when you answered emails between dessert and coffee. He looked slightly embarrassed. So do I. I thought being constantly available made me responsible. And now? I've realized giving someone your full attention is one of the most respectful things you can do. Jasmine smiled. I like this version of you. He returned the smile. I like him too. Those words stayed with Jasmine long after the conversation moved on. For years, Adrian had measured success by how much he accomplished. Now he was measuring it by how present he could be. That was a different kind of wealth. A week later, Jasmine received unexpected news. The city had selected her firm to lead the restoration of the historic Monroe Performing Arts Theater, one of the largest preservation projects in Illinois. The announcement spread quickly through the architectural community. Her office erupted in celebration. Luis nearly spilled coffee while reading the official email. We got it. The entire team applauded. Elena hugged Jasmine so tightly she could barely breathe. I knew it. Jasmine laughed. So did I. No, you didn't. No. She admitted. I hoped. That afternoon her phone buzzed. It was Adrian. Congratulations. I'm incredibly proud of you. Would you like to celebrate? Only if you're free. Jasmine smiled. The old Adrian would have already made reservations. The new Adrian asked first. She replied, dinner sounds nice. That evening they met at a small Italian restaurant in Lincoln Park. Not luxurious, not exclusive, just warm, comfortable. The owner greeted several customers by name. Soft music played quietly in the background. It reminded Jasmine of something. Halfway through dinner, Adrian noticed her smiling. What? I just realized. What? This is the first restaurant we've been to since. He nodded. I know. Neither looked uncomfortable. Neither tried to avoid the memory. Instead, Adrian spoke first. Thank you. She looked surprised. For what? For not allowing one painful place to become the definition of every restaurant after it. She smiled. I almost did. What changed? She looked around the room. I realized buildings don't hurt people. He nodded. People do. And people can heal. The waiter arrived with dessert. Neither realized they had just talked about the past without pain leading the conversation. That alone revealed how much had changed. The following Saturday, Adrian invited Jasmine to accompany him to a charity event at the Youth Entrepreneurship Program. This time, she wasn't attending as a guest. She was one of the speakers. The auditorium was filled with teenagers preparing to graduate high school. Many came from neighborhoods where opportunities felt limited. Jasmine stood at the podium. She looked around the room, then smiled. When I was your age, I believed successful people never struggled. Several students laughed. I was wrong. The room grew quiet. The strongest people I've ever met weren't the ones who never failed. They were the ones willing to learn. She looked toward Adrian sitting in the front row. And one of life's greatest lessons is that asking for help is never a sign of weakness. The students applauded. After the event ended, a young girl approached Jasmine. I've never heard adults talk about mistakes like that. Jasmine knelt slightly so they were at eye level. Everyone makes mistakes. The girl hesitated. Even successful people. Jasmine smiled. Especially successful people. What makes the difference is whether they choose to learn from them. The girl nodded thoughtfully before walking away. Adrian had watched the entire conversation. As they left the building together, he spoke quietly. You know. What? You've changed the way I think about leadership. She looked surprised. I have? He nodded. I used to think leaders needed all the answers. And now? I think they need the courage to admit when they don't. She smiled warmly. I think your students today would agree. Later that week, Adrian received a phone call he hadn't expected. Claire. He stared at the screen for several seconds. Months earlier, he might have answered privately and figured out how to explain it later. Instead, he answered, Hello. Hi, Adrian. Her voice sounded cheerful. I wanted to let you know. I finally moved to London. I'm happy for you. I also wanted to thank you. For what? For meeting me that night. He smiled faintly. I'm glad you found peace. I did. She paused. I hope you have too. I think I'm getting there. I always believed you would. After they hung up, Adrian looked at his phone for a moment. Then he did something the old version of himself never would have done. He called Jasmine. She answered on the second ring. Hi. Hi. I wanted to tell you something. What happened? I just spoke with Claire. Silence, not tense, simply attentive. She called to tell me she'd officially moved overseas. Jasmine smiled softly. Thank you for telling me. I promised myself. He looked out his office window. That I would never again let honesty arrive late. Those words warmed Jasmine's heart far more than any expensive gift ever could. Transparency wasn't becoming something Adrian remembered after problems appeared. It was becoming his new habit. Trust grows strongest when honesty becomes ordinary. That evening, Jasmine reflected on the phone call while organizing drawings for her new theater project. She realized something unexpected. She hadn't felt threatened. She hadn't imagined worst-case scenarios. She hadn't questioned his motives. Not because she'd become naive. Because Adrian had given her something he'd never consistently given before. Information before suspicion. Truth before discovery. Respect before explanation. She finally understood something her grandmother had told her months earlier. Healthy love feels calm. Not boring. Not predictable. Calm. Because neither person spends every day wondering what the other isn't saying. A few days later, Jasmine and Adrian walked along the Chicago River after dinner. The snow had begun melting. Small signs of spring appeared, despite the lingering cold. As they stopped beneath one of the city's historic bridges, Adrian looked toward the water. I've been thinking. Jasmine laughed. That usually leads somewhere important. He smiled. I hope so. He turned toward her. I don't miss the relationship we used to have. She looked surprised. You don't? He shook his head. No. I miss you. He paused. But I don't miss who we were. Jasmine felt emotion rise quietly inside her. Neither do I. They stood together beneath the bridge, watching the river flow steadily toward the lake. Life, Jasmine thought, was very much like that river. It never moved backward, only forward, carrying lessons, mistakes, healing, and hope. The past had shaped them, but it no longer controlled them. Neither of them realized it yet. But spring was about to ask them the question they had spent months preparing to answer. Not whether they still loved one another. That answer had quietly survived. The real question was whether they were finally ready to build a future where honesty arrived first, instead of last. March arrived carrying the first unmistakable signs of spring. The snow slowly disappeared from Chicago's sidewalks. Bare trees began showing tiny green buds. The air felt lighter. Hope, Jasmine often thought, rarely arrived all at once. It returned quietly. One ordinary day after another. In many ways, that was exactly how trust had returned. Not through dramatic promises, not through expensive gifts, not through emotional speeches, but through hundreds of small moments that slowly became impossible to ignore. A returned phone call, an honest answer, a difficult conversation that wasn't avoided, a promise kept. Character, Jasmine realized, wasn't built during extraordinary moments. It was revealed during ordinary ones. The restoration of the Monroe Performing Arts Theatre was now fully underway. Unlike the library project, this renovation presented a different challenge. The theatre's foundation was solid. Its structure was stable. But years of neglected maintenance had caused hidden damage behind beautifully painted walls. During an inspection, one of the engineers approached Jasmine carrying a report. We found moisture behind the west wall. She studied the photographs. It doesn't look serious. It isn't. He pointed toward the images. But, if nobody repairs it now, it eventually becomes structural. Jasmine smiled knowingly. Small problems rarely stay small. The engineer laughed. I've noticed you have a life lesson for everything. She laughed with him. Architecture has been teaching people about life for centuries. He folded the report. So what do we do? We don't panic. We don't hide it. And we definitely don't paint over it. She handed the report back. We repair it while it's still repairable. As the engineer walked away, Jasmine quietly reflected on her own words. Healthy relationships required exactly the same discipline. Address the problem while it's still a conversation, not after it becomes a crisis. That evening, Adrian met Dr. Monroe for another therapy session. As he settled into the familiar chair, she noticed something different. You seem lighter. He smiled. I think I am. What changed? He thought carefully before answering. I'm no longer trying to become someone Jasmine will forgive. She nodded. And? I'm trying to become someone I can respect. A warm smile spread across Dr. Monroe's face. That's an important difference. He leaned back comfortably. I used to think personal growth had a finish line. And now? I think it's more like maintenance. She laughed softly. Explain. You don't maintain a healthy relationship once. You maintain it every day. You don't choose honesty one time. You choose it repeatedly. She nodded proudly. I think you've discovered something many people never do. What? Growth isn't an event. It's a lifestyle. After therapy, Adrian stopped by his company's headquarters. The quarterly executive meeting had just ended. Normally, everyone rushed toward elevators the moment discussions concluded. This time, Adrian remained behind. So, he looked around the conference room. Before everyone leaves, I'd like to ask something. His executives exchanged curious glances. What could we have communicated better today? The room became unusually quiet. Finally, one department director raised her hand. You really want honest feedback? I do. She hesitated. Sometimes. People are afraid to disagree with you. Adrian nodded slowly. Thank you. Another executive spoke. I think we occasionally mistake your silence for disappointment. Instead of becoming defensive, Adrian wrote the comment down. Anything else? Within minutes, the room transformed. Ideas flowed freely. Constructive criticism replaced polite agreement. People who had spent years carefully choosing their words suddenly spoke with confidence. Afterward, Owen caught up with Adrian near the elevator. I've never seen a meeting like that. Adrian smiled. Neither have I. You weren't bothered? No. Why? Because honest feedback prevents expensive mistakes. Owen laughed. That's true in business. Adrian smiled knowingly. And everywhere else. Leadership, he realized, wasn't about creating rooms where everyone agreed. It was about creating rooms where people felt safe enough to tell the truth. The following Saturday, Jasmine and Adrian met for breakfast at a neighborhood cafe. The waitress smiled the moment they walked in. Your usual table? Jasmine laughed. We've become predictable. The waitress grinned. The best regulars usually are. After ordering breakfast, they found themselves watching rain fall softly outside the cafe windows. Spring showers had replaced winter snow. The city seemed to be waking up. Adrian looked across the table. I've been meaning to ask you something. What is it? When was the moment you realized you weren't angry anymore? Jasmine didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stirred her tea thoughtfully. I don't think it happened all at once. I stopped being angry the day I realized carrying resentment required more energy than healing. He nodded quietly. I understand that. She smiled. What about you? What was your turning point? Adrian looked out the window. The day I stopped trying to explain why I lied. And started asking why I believed lying was easier than telling the truth. She reached for her cup. That's a difficult question. It was. But it changed everything. Breakfast arrived. Between conversations about books, architecture, and community projects, something unexpected happened. There was a disagreement. A small one. Jasmine wanted to donate part of the theater's unused materials to a local arts program. Adrian thought auctioning them for charity might raise more money. Months earlier, one of them would have quietly surrendered just to avoid conflict. This time, neither did. I see your point, Jasmine said, but those materials could inspire students immediately. Adrian nodded. I agree. I just wonder whether selling them could help even more people. For nearly 15 minutes they discussed different possibilities. No raised voices, no hurt feelings, no withdrawal. Eventually, Jasmine smiled. We're both trying to help people. We're just approaching it differently. Adrian laughed. I think you're right. She looked at him. You know what's funny? What? A year ago. We would have avoided this conversation completely. He smiled. Now it's just breakfast. They both laughed. Sometimes the greatest evidence of healing isn't the absence of disagreement. It's discovering that disagreement no longer feels dangerous. As they left the cafe, the rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, reflecting across the wet streets. Jasmine looked toward Adrian. I used to think peaceful relationships never argued. And now? She smiled. I think peaceful relationships know how to argue kindly. Adrian looked at her with quiet admiration. I've learned something too. What? Honesty isn't only telling the truth after someone asks. He paused. It's creating a relationship where neither person has to wonder whether the truth is being hidden. Jasmine felt those words settle gently into her heart. This wasn't the same man who had once believed difficult conversations should be avoided. This was someone who had learned that trust isn't protected by silence. It's protected by transparency. As they walked in opposite directions toward their cars, neither noticed the elderly couple sitting beneath the cafe awning. The woman smiled as she watched them leave. They're different. Her husband nodded. Yes. They're finally walking beside each other instead of around each other. Neither Jasmine nor Adrian heard the comment, but it was true. For months, they had been rebuilding something neither of them fully understood. Not simply a relationship, a way of loving that made honesty feel safe. And that foundation was stronger than anything they had built before. Spring settled gently over Chicago. The trees along the Riverwalk were covered in fresh green leaves. Outdoor cafes reopened. Street musicians returned to the sidewalks. The city seemed to breathe differently. Everything felt as though it had survived another difficult season. Jasmine often thought healing looked a lot like spring. Nothing changed overnight. The transformation happened so gradually that one day you simply looked around and realized life had become beautiful again. Over the following month, Jasmine and Adrian continued spending time together. Not because they were trying to recreate the past, because they genuinely enjoyed the people they had become. Some Saturdays they visited neighborhood farmers markets. Other weekends they attended community art fairs. Sometimes they spent entire afternoons volunteering. Other days they simply walked through the city talking about books, childhood memories, or dreams they'd never shared before. One evening, while strolling along the Chicago River, Jasmine suddenly laughed. "What?" Adrian asked. "I just realized something." "What?" "We've spent more time talking these last 3 months than we did during our first 2 years together." Adrian smiled sheepishly. "You're right." She shook her head, still smiling. "Isn't that strange?" "It is." He looked toward the water. "I thought love meant being understood without words. And now? I think love means caring enough to keep learning each other." Jasmine looked at him warmly. "I couldn't agree more. People change, dreams change, fears change. Healthy love grows because two people keep discovering each other instead of assuming they already know everything." One afternoon, Adrian received an invitation to speak at a national business leadership conference. The organizers wanted him to discuss innovation and entrepreneurship. Months earlier, his presentation would have focused entirely on profit, leadership, and business growth. This time, he surprised everyone. Standing before hundreds of executives, entrepreneurs, and university students, Adrian adjusted the microphone and smiled. "When people ask me about success, they usually expect me to talk about companies." Soft laughter spread through the audience. "I'm going to disappoint you." More laughter. "The greatest lesson I've learned wasn't in a boardroom. It came from losing the trust of someone I loved." The room grew completely still. "I discovered something that changed the way I lead." He paused. "If people are afraid to tell you the truth, you are not leading. You are controlling." Several audience members immediately began taking notes. Adrian continued. "The strongest businesses are the strongest friendships. The strongest families. All have one thing in common. They create safety for honesty." He smiled. "Without that, no amount of success can protect what matters most." The audience rose in a standing ovation, not because he spoke like a billionaire, because he spoke like a human being. That evening, Adrian called Jasmine. "I think I embarrassed my public relations team." She laughed. "What happened?" "I spent 20 minutes talking about emotional honesty at a business conference." She laughed even harder. "I would have paid to see that." "I'll send you the recording." "I'd like that." He smiled. "I mentioned you." She looked surprised. "You did?" "Not by name. But I talked about the person who taught me that honesty isn't weakness." There was a brief silence. Then Jasmine quietly said, "I don't think I taught you." "What do you mean?" "I think life did. I was just standing there when it happened." Adrian smiled to himself. Her humility was one of the many reasons he admired her. Meanwhile, the Monroe Performing Arts Theatre restoration neared completion. During the final inspection, city officials walked through the beautifully restored building. One council member stopped beside Jasmine. "I have to admit, I was one of the people who wanted to demolish this place." She smiled. "And now?" He slowly looked around the magnificent theatre. "I would have destroyed something worth saving." Jasmine nodded thoughtfully. "We've all done that at some point." He looked at her curiously. "What do you mean?" She smiled. "Sometimes in buildings. Sometimes in relationships." The council member chuckled. "I'll remember that." A week later, Jasmine received another unexpected call. It was from her father. They spoke occasionally, but never for long. "Hi, sweetheart." "Hi, Dad. I read an article about the theatre." She smiled. "News travels fast." "It does." There was an unusual pause. Then he quietly said, "I owe you an apology." Jasmine felt her heart slow. "For what?" "For the kind of home your mother and I created." She closed her eyes. Dad. Ah, no. Let me finish. I spent years believing children didn't notice everything. I was wrong. Another long silence followed. I'm sorry you had to become the peacemaker. Tears filled Jasmine's eyes. She hadn't expected this conversation, not after all these years. You deserved parents, not problems to solve. Jasmine couldn't speak for several seconds. Finally, she whispered, "Thank you." No dramatic reconciliation, no rewriting history. Just two honest people acknowledging a painful truth. Sometimes, healing reaches across generations. That evening, Jasmine told Adrian about the phone call. He listened quietly. When she finished, he asked, "How do you feel?" She smiled through tears. Lighter. Not because the past changed. She looked out toward the city lights. But because someone finally admitted it happened. Adrian nodded. Being believed is healing. She looked at him. It really is. Several days later, Adrian received an unexpected visitor at his office. His father. The older man looked uncomfortable. "I won't keep you long." Adrian gestured toward the chair. "Please." After sitting down, his father remained unusually quiet. Finally, he spoke. "You asked me something a few months ago." Adrian remembered immediately. "Who did you talk to when something important happened?" "I've been thinking about it." "And?" His father looked down at his hands. "The truth is, I didn't talk to anyone." Adrian waited. "I thought that made me strong." A sad smile crossed his face. "I think it just made me lonely." Neither man spoke. For the first time in Adrian's life, his father looked less like an authority figure, and more like a man carrying decades of emotional weight. "I wasn't a very good example," his father admitted quietly. Adrian looked at him for a long moment. "No." The honesty surprised them both. "But, he continued, "it's not too late for either of us to learn." His father's eyes became glassy. "I hope you're right." As the older man left the office, Adrian realized something profound. Parents shape us, but they do not have to define us forever. Every generation has the opportunity to end cycles the previous one didn't know how to break. That weekend, Jasmine and Adrian met once again beneath the bridge, where they'd shared one of their most meaningful conversations months earlier. The river flowed peacefully beneath them. Spring flowers lined the walking path. Children rode bicycles nearby. Life looked wonderfully ordinary. Jasmine smiled. "I like it here." "So do I." "It reminds me how much has changed." Adrian nodded. "I've been thinking about us." She laughed softly. "You've been thinking again." "I have." She looked at him expectantly. "I don't want to go backward." She smiled. "Neither do I. I don't want what we had." She reached for the railing beside her. "I don't either." They looked at each other, both smiling now. For the first time, they weren't mourning the past. They were grateful they had outgrown it. The question that remained wasn't whether they still loved one another. It was whether they were finally ready to choose each other again. Not because they feared losing one another, but because they genuinely admired the people they had become. And that answer would arrive sooner than either of them expected. By early May, Chicago no longer felt like it was waking from winter. It was fully alive. Trees stretched wide with fresh green leaves. Outdoor cafes overflowed onto sidewalks. The Riverwalk buzzed with conversation, music, and laughter. The city hadn't become new. It had simply become itself again. Jasmine often thought people healed the same way. Healing didn't erase the past. It simply allowed you to live beyond it. Nearly a year had passed since the night everything changed inside Le Marais. A year since 3 simple words, "I love you," had become tangled in a lie. Looking back, Jasmine realized something surprising. She no longer remembered that evening as the day her relationship ended. She remembered it as the day both of them were finally forced to become honest. Pain had opened a door that comfort never could. One Friday afternoon, Jasmine stood alone on the stage of the fully restored Monroe Performing Arts Theatre. The renovation was complete. Workers had packed their tools. The heavy construction barriers were gone. Sunlight streamed through the restored stained glass windows, painting colorful patterns across polished wooden floors. She slowly walked down the center aisle, running her fingertips across the velvet seats, listening to the beautiful silence filling the room. Luis joined her a few moments later. "You did it." Jasmine smiled. "We all did." He looked around the magnificent theater. "You know." "Oh, what?" "I've worked with a lot of architects." She laughed. "I hope that's a compliment." "It is. But you're different." "How?" "You never talk about saving buildings." He looked toward the restored stage. "You talk about preserving stories." Jasmine stood quietly. After a moment she answered, "Because every building teaches us something." Louise smiled. "And what did this one teach you?" She looked around the theater one last time. "That restoration isn't about pretending damage never happened." She paused. "It's about making sure the damage doesn't become the ending." Louise nodded slowly. "I think that's true for people too." "So do I." That evening, the city hosted a private preview before the theater officially reopened to the public. Architects, artists, community leaders, construction workers, everyone who had helped bring the building back to life received an invitation. Jasmine almost attended alone. Almost. Then her phone vibrated. It was Adrian. "Congratulations on finishing another impossible project. Would you be comfortable if I attended tonight? If you'd rather celebrate with your team, I completely understand." Jasmine smiled. The old Adrian would have assumed. The new Adrian always asked. She replied, "I'd like you to come." An hour later, Adrian arrived. He wasn't carrying flowers. He wasn't holding an expensive gift. Instead, he carried a small paper bag from a neighborhood bookstore. As they greeted each other, Jasmine looked curiously at the bag. "What's this?" "A congratulations gift." She laughed. "I thought we agreed not to spend ridiculous amounts of money on each other." "We did." She peeked inside. It was a hardcover journal. Its cover was embossed with a simple quote. "Every restoration begins with an honest inspection." Jasmine looked up. "You saw this and thought of me." He smiled. "And thought of us." Her eyes softened. It wasn't extravagant. It was thoughtful. Some gifts become valuable because of their price. Others become priceless because someone truly understands the person receiving them. As guests explored the restored theater, Jasmine introduced Adrian to members of her team. Luis shook his hand warmly. "So, you're Adrian." "I am." Luis smiled knowingly. "We've heard about you." Adrian looked at Jasmine. "I hope only good things." Jasmine laughed. "Mostly." Everyone laughed together. There was no awkwardness, no tension, no hidden history hanging over the conversation. Just ordinary people enjoying an ordinary evening. That, Jasmine realized, was extraordinary. Later, the mayor invited Jasmine onto the stage for a brief recognition ceremony. After thanking the restoration team, he turned toward the audience. "Great buildings aren't preserved by one person. They're preserved by communities." He smiled. "The same is true of healthy cities. And, perhaps," he added thoughtfully, "healthy lives." The audience applauded. As Jasmine stepped away from the podium, her eyes briefly found Adrian standing near the back of the theater. He wasn't trying to attract her attention. He wasn't recording the moment on his phone. He was simply smiling. Proud, present, completely there. Months earlier, he would have been answering emails between speeches. Now, he hadn't looked at his phone once. People don't always announce they've changed. Sometimes they simply stop repeating the behaviors that once caused pain. After the ceremony, guests slowly drifted toward the lobby for refreshments. Jasmine and Adrian slipped outside onto the theater's front steps to enjoy the warm evening air. Downtown Chicago glowed beneath the setting sun. For a while, they simply watched people pass by. Finally, Adrian spoke. "Can I tell you something?" "You always can." He took a slow breath. "I used to think love was finding the right person." She listened quietly. "I don't believe that anymore." "What do you believe?" "I think love is two people choosing to become the right people." Again and again. Jasmine smiled. "I like that." He looked toward the busy street. "I also realized something else." "What?" "I spent years saying, 'I love you.'" He paused. "I never understood those words create responsibility." She looked at him thoughtfully. "What kind of responsibility?" "To make your actions feel safe enough for someone to believe them." The sentence settled gently between them. Jasmine felt tears sting her eyes. Not from sadness, from recognition. That was the lesson their entire journey had been teaching. Words become believable only when they're consistently supported by actions. As they began walking toward the river, they passed a young couple sitting on a bench. The two were clearly arguing. The young man folded his arms, while the woman looked away. After a few moments, both became quiet. Adrian watched them for a second before continuing to walk. Jasmine glanced back. "They'll figure it out." "You think so?" She nodded. "If they learn to talk before silence hardens into distance." He smiled. "You've become very wise." She laughed. "No. I've become experienced." There was a difference. Wisdom often grows from mistakes we're willing to learn from. They reached the riverwalk just as the sky turned shades of pink and gold. The water reflected the evening light, carrying gentle ripples toward Lake Michigan. They stopped at the exact place where, months earlier, they had admitted they no longer wanted the relationship they used to have. Adrian looked at the river, then at Jasmine. I've been asking myself one question for weeks. What question? If we ever started again. He smiled softly. Could we promise each other something? Jasmine tilted her head. What? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the flowing water, knowing the next conversation would shape the rest of their story. And for the first time, neither of them felt afraid of where honesty might lead, because they had finally become the kind of people who understood that love isn't protected by perfect words. It's protected by truthful ones. The river moved steadily beneath the bridge, not rushing, not hesitating, simply continuing forward. Jasmine rested her hands lightly on the railing as she watched the evening sunlight shimmer across the water. She turned toward Adrian. You asked if we could promise each other something. I did. What is it? He smiled, though there was a hint of nervousness in his eyes. No more hidden fears. She waited. No more deciding what the other person can or can't handle. He took a slow breath. If something scares me, I'll tell you. If I make a mistake, you'll hear it from me first. If I'm uncertain, I'll let you stand beside me instead of pretending I have everything under control. The wind carried a few strands of Jasmine's hair across her face. She brushed them back gently. Then she smiled. I can promise that too. Adrian looked relieved. But I have one promise to add. What is it? If something hurts me, I won't disappear. He nodded. I'll tell you. If I feel afraid, I'll say it. If I don't understand something, I'll ask instead of assuming. A quiet smile spread across Adrian's face. That would have saved us a lot of pain. She laughed softly. It probably would have. Neither of them pretended those promises guaranteed a perfect future. They simply understood that healthy relationships are not built by avoiding problems. They're built by facing them together. They continued walking along the riverwalk until they reached a small cafe overlooking the water. Without discussing it, they chose a table outside. The evening was warm. Boats drifted slowly along the river. Musicians played jazz several yards away. It felt wonderfully ordinary. A waiter approached. Can I get you anything? Jasmine smiled. Tea. Adrian looked at the menu before laughing. I already know what you're ordering. She raised an eyebrow. You do? Earl Grey. With honey. No lemon. She laughed, still paying attention. I plan to keep paying attention. The waiter turned toward Adrian. And for you? He smiled. The grilled salmon. Jasmine looked surprised. You changed your favorite. He nodded. I tried yours one night. I liked it better. She laughed. You never told me. I guess I'm getting better at sharing things. The waiter smiled at the easy conversation before walking away. Sometimes, love reveals itself in remarkably small moments. Remembering how someone takes their tea, listening without checking your phone, sharing tiny pieces of your day before they become important. Those ordinary habits quietly become extraordinary trust. As they finished dinner, Jasmine looked across the table. Can I ask one last question? You can ask me 100. She smiled. I'll settle for one. When you sent that text. His smile faded slightly. I love you. Yes? What do those words mean to you now? Adrian didn't answer quickly. He wanted the response to deserve the question. Finally he spoke. I don't think they're a promise that nothing will ever go wrong. Jasmine listened carefully. I think they're a promise that nothing important will ever have to be hidden. He paused. I used to believe saying those words proved my love. He gently shook his head. Now I think living them proves it. Jasmine felt tears gather in her eyes. Not because the answer was perfect, because it was true. She reached across the table. For the first time in nearly a year, she took his hand. Not out of desperation, not because she feared losing him, but because she trusted the man sitting across from her. Adrian looked at their hands and smiled. I've missed this. So have I. A few weeks later, on a bright Saturday morning, Jasmine stood once again outside Le Marais. The same restaurant, the same entrance, the same view of the Chicago River. Nearly 1 year earlier she had walked away carrying heartbreak and unanswered questions. Today, she arrived carrying peace. A hostess recognized her immediately. It's wonderful to see you again. Jasmine smiled. It's good to be back. A familiar voice spoke gently behind her. I was hoping you'd say that. She turned. Adrian stood there. Not inside pretending to be somewhere else. not sending messages that contradicted reality, simply standing exactly where he said he would be. On time, waiting for her. They entered the restaurant together. This time, there were no secrets hidden behind candlelight. No conversations concealed by silence. Only honesty. The waiter led them to a table near the window. As they sat down, Jasmine's phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen. A message from Adrian. She looked up at him, amused. "You just texted me?" He grinned. "Open it." She did. The message read, "I love you." She looked at him. He was smiling. Not because he hoped the words would fix anything, but because they no longer had to. His actions had spent months preparing the way for them. Jasmine locked her phone without replying. Instead, she reached across the table and gently squeezed his hand. "I believe you." Those 3 words meant more than any declaration either of them had ever made. Because trust had returned. Not through one conversation, not through one apology, not through one grand romantic gesture, but through hundreds of honest choices made when no one else was watching. Months later, people who knew Jasmine and Adrian often commented on how peaceful their relationship seemed. They laughed easily, disagreed respectfully, listened carefully. Friends assumed they'd simply found the perfect relationship. They smiled whenever they heard that. The truth was much simpler. They hadn't found a perfect relationship. They had learned how to build a healthy one. And healthy relationships are never accidentally discovered. They are intentionally created, every single day, through honesty, respect, patience, kindness, and the courage to speak before silence becomes distance. If there's one lesson Jasmine and Adrian would want others to remember, it's this. Love isn't measured by how often someone says, "I love you." It's measured by whether their actions make those words feel safe to believe. Because silence can protect us for a moment, but only honesty can protect a lifetime. And sometimes, the greatest love stories are not about finding the right person. They're about becoming the right people, together. As Jasmine and Adrian's journey comes to an end, we'd love to hear from you. What was the biggest lesson this story taught you? Was it about honesty, trust, second chances, or learning to communicate before silence creates distance? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your words may encourage someone who needs hope today. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, and turn on notifications so you never miss another inspiring love story filled with meaningful life lessons. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that real love is built on honesty, patience, and everyday choices, not just beautiful words, please share this story with them. Thank you for spending this journey with us. Until next time, remember, don't just tell the people you love how you feel. Show them through your actions every single day. We'll see you in the next story.